Imagine yourself standing in a grocery store aisle facing 37 varieties of olive oil, each one promising something slightly different: organic, cold-pressed from a specific Italian region, infused with herbs, or touted for its health benefits. You came in wanting to purchase a simple bottle of olive oil, yet instead of feeling empowered by abundance, you feel paralyzed by indecision. You spend 15 minutes comparing labels, reading reviews on your phone, and second-guessing whether you should have just picked the first one. This is the paradox of choice in its purest form, a phenomenon that extends far beyond grocery shopping into nearly every domain of modern life, from selecting a career path to choosing a life partner to deciding which streaming service to subscribe to. The mechanism behind this paradox operates through a counterintuitive psychological principle. As the number of available options increases, our satisfaction with our final decision actually decreases, and our decision-making process becomes increasingly difficult and anxiety-ridden. When faced with abundant choices, we experience cognitive overload, a state in which our brain struggles to process and compare all available information simultaneously. Additionally, more choices create higher expectations for the outcome, meaning that whatever we eventually select is more likely to disappoint us, because it cannot possibly be perfectly optimal across every dimension. We also experience increased regret, constantly wondering if one of the unchosen alternatives might have been superior, a phenomenon psychologists call opportunity cost, where the value we assign to our choice is diminished by our awareness of what we gave up. What makes this paradox particularly persistent and puzzling is that logically, more options should always be better, should always increase the likelihood that we find something perfectly suited to our needs, yet consistently, the evidence shows the opposite to be true. Imagine a person collapses on a busy street during rush hour, surrounded by dozens of passersby who witness the event unfold before them. Yet nobody moves to help, nobody calls for emergency services, and the person lies there for minutes that feel like hours, while the crowd simply walks around them as if the scene is merely part of the urban landscape. This phenomenon, known as the Bystander Effect, reveals something profoundly unsettling about human nature when we find ourselves in the presence of others during moments of crisis. The mechanism driving this paradoxical behavior operates through several interconnected psychological processes that work together to paralyze our instinct to help. When multiple people are present at an emergency, individuals experience what researchers call diffusion of responsibility, wherein each person assumes that someone else in the crowd will take action, thereby distributing the weight of accountability across so many shoulders that it effectively disappears entirely. Simultaneously, our brains engage in pluralistic ignorance, a state where we look to others for cues about how to interpret a situation, and when we observe others remaining calm and uninvolved, we reinterpret the emergency as perhaps not actually being an emergency at all, convincing ourselves that the person may simply be sleeping or that intervention might be unwelcome. The presence of an audience also triggers evaluation apprehension, where we become acutely aware that our actions are being observed and judged, making us hesitant to help for fear of appearing foolish or overreacting. What makes this paradox so deeply troubling is that it persists even among compassionate individuals who genuinely care about human suffering, yet find themselves frozen by these invisible psychological forces. We have normalized this collective inaction into the background of modern life, accepting that in crowds we become less responsible, less empathetic, and less likely to intervene, as though being surrounded by others somehow absolves us of our individual moral obligation to recognize another person's suffering and act upon it. Imagine a scenario where someone with minimal knowledge about a subject becomes absolutely certain they are an expert, while simultaneously, the truly knowledgeable person in the room remains plagued by self-doubt and qualification. This person who has only recently picked up a guitar feels confident enough to offer unsolicited advice to musicians with decades of experience, while the accomplished musician second-guesses their own abilities and assumes everyone else must know far more than they actually do. This phenomenon reveals itself in countless professional and personal contexts, from the novice investor who believes they have decoded the stock market after reading a single book, to the amateur historian who corrects academics in social settings, to the new parent who judges experienced parents for methods they do not yet understand. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through a specific cognitive deficit that creates a double bind of ignorance and overconfidence simultaneously. When someone lacks knowledge in a particular domain, They simply do not possess the cognitive tools necessary to recognize and evaluate the limits of their own understanding, because recognizing those limits would require the very expertise they are lacking. This creates a protective bubble of false confidence, where incompetence masks itself through inability to perceive incompetence. Conversely, as someone actually develops genuine expertise and competence, they become acutely aware of how much remains unknown, how many edge cases exist, how many variables they had not previously considered, and therefore their confidence naturally diminishes even as their actual capability increases dramatically. What persists despite the logical absurdity of this arrangement is our cultural tendency to mistake confidence for competence, allowing the loudest and most certain voices to gain influence and authority, regardless of whether their certainty is earned or simply symptomatic of their ignorance, creating systems where incompetence visibly rises while competence quietly doubts itself. Imagine a conversation where you present someone with factual evidence that contradicts their deeply held belief, and instead of reconsidering their position, they become more convinced of their original stance than ever before. This phenomenon, known as the Backfire Effect, describes the counterintuitive moment when confronting someone with contradictory information actually strengthens their commitment to false beliefs rather than weakening it. The mechanism at work here involves several layers of psychological protection that our minds automatically activate when we feel threatened. When we encounter information that challenges our worldview or identity, we don't process it as neutral data. Instead, we experience it as a personal attack on who we are and what we value. Our brains interpret this threat and respond by doubling down on existing beliefs as a form of self-defense, because admitting we were wrong feels like admitting that we ourselves are fundamentally flawed or foolish. The backfire effect persists because it taps into our deeper need for cognitive consistency and identity protection, which operate beneath the level of rational deliberation. We are not purely logical creatures evaluating evidence in a vacuum. We are meaning-making beings who have constructed an entire sense of self around our beliefs, and when those beliefs are challenged, we protect them with the same intensity we would protect our children. What makes this paradox particularly persistent in modern society is that we continue to believe direct confrontation and evidence presentation will change minds, despite overwhelming evidence that this approach often fails and frequently backfires. We normalize this behavior by treating belief formation as if it were a simple matter of information transfer, when in reality it is deeply entangled with identity, belonging, and self-worth. Stockholm Syndrome emerges from one of the most counterintuitive psychological phenomena we observe in human relationships, originating from a real bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden in 1973, where hostages held for 6 days developed a profound emotional bond with their captors, ultimately defending them and resisting rescue efforts, a response so unexpected that it challenged everything psychologists believed about trauma and survival instinct. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through a sophisticated combination of isolation, dependency, and threat perception, wherein when a person becomes entirely reliant on another for their basic survival and experiences both danger and intermittent kindness from that same source, their brain develops a protective mechanism that reframes the relationship, transforming the captor into a rescuer figure and normalizing abuse as occasional mercy rather than systematic harm. The psychological brain essentially creates a narrative where gratitude for not being killed becomes genuine affection, where the withholding of pain becomes an act of generosity, and where escape feels like betrayal rather than survival, because cognitive dissonance between fear and dependency becomes too overwhelming to maintain consciously. What makes this phenomenon particularly persistent despite its illogical foundation is that it doesn't require dramatic kidnappings to occur. It manifests quietly in workplace relationships where employees develop loyalty to abusive managers, in family systems where children bond intensely with neglectful or harmful parents, in romantic partnerships where individuals defend partners who demean them, each instance following the same psychological architecture of isolation, intermittent reinforcement. And the human brain's extraordinary capacity to rewrite narratives in order to make unbearable situations psychologically tolerable, reminding us that our minds are not always designed to protect our well-being, but rather to ensure our immediate survival and psychological coherence, even when that coherence comes at tremendous cost to our actual safety and flourishing. Imagine a private individual who discovers that a photograph of their home has been published online without their consent, accessible to anyone with an internet connection, tucked away in some obscure corner of the web where perhaps only a handful of people have ever seen it. The natural instinct, the protective response, is to demand its removal, to hire lawyers, to make a public statement about the violation of privacy, to fight with every available resource. Yet in doing so, something unexpected happens. The very act of fighting against the image, of drawing attention to its existence through legal action and public outcry, causes exponentially more people to become aware of it. What might have remained known to dozens of people becomes known to millions. The attempt to suppress the information paradoxically amplifies it beyond anything the original publication could have achieved. This is the Streisand Effect, named after an incident where singer Barbra Streisand attempted to remove photographs of her home from a publicly available collection, only to discover that her legal action generated vastly more attention and distribution of the very images she sought to hide. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon is multifaceted and deeply human. First, there exists within us a natural curiosity that is specifically activated by prohibition and restriction. When we are told that something is forbidden, that information is being suppressed, we become intensely interested in discovering what is being hidden from us. The very act of censorship creates a narrative of secrecy that our minds find irresistible. Additionally, the story of someone attempting to suppress information becomes more interesting, more compelling, and more widely discussed than the original information itself. The conflict, the drama, the David versus Goliath narrative of an individual fighting against the tide of the internet creates a more engaging story that people want to share with others. Consider the person who has applied for dozens of jobs without success, who now no longer bothers to craft careful cover letters or prepare for interviews, moving through the application process with resigned perfunctoriness because they have internalized the belief that their effort simply does not matter. Consider the student who performed poorly on early exams and now sits in class with a kind of passive acceptance, taking notes without genuine engagement, having concluded that studying yields no meaningful improvement in their outcomes. Consider the individual trapped in a relationship marked by repeated disappointment, who stops voicing concerns or advocating for their own needs because past attempts to communicate have consistently been dismissed or ignored. These are manifestations of learned helplessness, a psychological state where a person or animal develops a profound sense of powerlessness after experiencing repeated failure or punishment despite genuine effort to escape or improve the situation. The mechanism operates through a process of cognitive reorientation, where the individual gradually shifts from attributing outcomes to external, changeable factors toward attributing them to internal, permanent deficiencies or to the unchangeable nature of their circumstances. The brain essentially learns to predict that action yields no reward and inaction yields no additional harm, creating a kind of emotional hibernation where the motivation to engage with challenges simply atrophies. What becomes striking is how this belief persists even when conditions change, even when new opportunities for control and agency suddenly become available, and even when objective evidence suggests that effort might now produce results. The person continues to move through the world as though chains still bind them long after the locks have been opened, demonstrating that our sense of power over our lives is not rationally recalculated in real time, but rather becomes a foundational belief system that resists contradiction. Imagine a highly accomplished professional walking into a conference room, commanding respect through years of demonstrated expertise and flawless execution, only to trip slightly on the carpet and catch themselves against the table. In that single moment of vulnerability, something shifts in the minds of those watching. Rather than losing respect or being viewed as incompetent, this person somehow becomes more likable, more relatable, more human in the eyes of their colleagues. This phenomenon is known as the Pratfall Effect, a psychological pattern where minor mistakes or moments of imperfection actually increase likability in those perceived as highly competent. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through a subtle recalibration of how we perceive excellence. When someone appears completely flawless and superior, they can trigger feelings of inadequacy or distance in observers, a gap that feels too wide to bridge. However, when that same person demonstrates a small, harmless mistake or moment of clumsiness, it humanizes them in a way that creates psychological proximity. We recognize ourselves in their imperfection, and paradoxically, this makes us feel closer to them and more positively disposed toward them. The effect works precisely because the person's overall competence remains intact while their relatability increases dramatically. But this effect reverses entirely when applied to those already perceived as lacking competence. Should someone viewed as incompetent make a mistake, it only reinforces negative perceptions, deepening the gap rather than bridging it. The Pratfall Effect, then, becomes a reminder of how our judgment of others operates within complex layers of established reputation and social perception, where the same action produces entirely different outcomes depending on the context from which it emerges. Imagine you encounter someone you have recently met, someone toward whom you feel relatively neutral, perhaps even slightly indifferent, and you find yourself in a situation where you must ask them for a small favor, something modest and manageable like borrowing a pen or receiving brief directions to a nearby location. In most cases, people comply with such requests readily enough, and the interaction concludes without much consequence. However, something peculiar then begins to unfold within the mind of the person who granted you this favor, something counterintuitive to what our rational expectations might suggest. The person who helped you does not harbor resentment or feel drained by the interaction. Instead, they experience a subtle shift in their emotional regard toward you, finding themselves liking you more than they did before, feeling more warmth in your presence, and developing a genuine interest in your well-being and future interactions. This phenomenon bears the name of Benjamin Franklin, who famously documented this effect after requesting a rare book from a political adversary, only to discover that their relationship improved dramatically following the favor. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradoxical outcome emerges from the human mind's need to maintain internal consistency and coherence in self-perception. When a person performs an action, their brain works backward to justify that action by examining their attitudes and beliefs, reasoning that they must genuinely like or value someone if they have taken the effort to help them. Otherwise, their behavior would feel contradictory to their self-image as a generally kind and reasonable individual. This cognitive reconciliation process, known as cognitive dissonance reduction, transforms the relationship fundamentally without either party consciously intending for such change to occur. Imagine yourself lying in bed on a night when you desperately need sleep, perhaps because an important meeting awaits you in the morning, and as your head touches the pillow, you make a conscious decision that tonight you will fall asleep quickly and easily. Yet within minutes, your mind becomes hyper-aware of the very thing you are trying to suppress, the thought of falling asleep. You find yourself monitoring your breathing, checking whether your eyes feel heavy, wondering if you're close to drifting off, and in doing so, you remain painfully awake. The harder you try to force sleep to arrive, the more elusive it becomes, and you spend hours in a frustrating cycle of mental effort that produces the exact opposite of your intention. This paradoxical phenomenon is ironic process theory, first formally described by psychologist Daniel Wegner, and it reveals something fundamental about how the human mind actually works when we attempt to suppress or control our own thoughts and behaviors. The mechanism operates through a dual process system. When we consciously try not to think about something, our mind must first access that very thought in order to monitor whether we are successfully avoiding it, and this constant monitoring actually keeps the unwanted thought more accessible and prominent in our consciousness than it would have been if we had simply allowed it to pass naturally. The irony deepens because the more motivated we are to suppress a thought, the harder our mind works to detect it, which paradoxically makes it stronger and more intrusive. We cannot think about not thinking about something without thinking about it, and this logical impossibility creates a catch-22 that operates silently in countless moments of daily life. Whether you are trying not to focus on an anxiety about social judgment, attempting to suppress a craving for something you have decided to avoid, or working to keep your mind from wandering during a crucial conversation, the very act of trying to control your thoughts often strengthens them instead. Imagine a sweltering summer afternoon in a small Texas town where a family sits together in an air-conditioned home, perfectly comfortable and content in their shared space. One family member suggests taking a drive to Abilene, a distant city known for its unremarkable attractions and dusty roads, a journey that would involve hours in a hot car and an unpleasant experience for everyone involved. The proposal hangs in the air with an awkward silence, yet one by one, each family member agrees to the plan, each believing that the others genuinely want to go, each assuming their own reluctance is somehow selfish or antisocial. They drive together through the heat and discomfort, arguing during the journey, arriving at their destination feeling frustrated and exhausted, only to discover upon returning home that not a single person actually wanted to go to Abilene in the first place. Each family member had agreed against their own preference, driven by a misguided desire to please the others and maintain harmony within the group. This phenomenon, termed the Abilene Paradox, represents a profound contradiction in human group dynamics, where a collective decision emerges that nobody actually supports or desires, yet the group collectively endorses and executes it anyway. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox involves multiple reinforcing factors: the fear of appearing selfish or obstructive, the assumption that silence indicates consent or preference, the reluctance to voice disagreement that might create conflict or disharmony, and the tendency to misread the emotional temperature of the group based on incomplete information. We assume that others' apparent enthusiasm reflects their true desires rather than considering that they might be performing the same social calculation we are performing, leading to a cascade of false consensus that solidifies into collective action. Imagine a person who deeply identifies as an environmentalist, someone who speaks passionately about climate change and the importance of sustainability at dinner parties and on social media. Yet this same individual drives a gas-guzzling SUV, takes multiple flights each year for leisure travel, and purchases fast fashion without hesitation. When confronted with this contradiction, they might explain that their single actions don't matter in the grand scheme of things, or that their professional responsibilities require the vehicle, or that they deserve occasional indulgences despite their values. This internal conflict, this uncomfortable psychological friction between their stated beliefs and their actual behaviors, represents one of the most fundamental and pervasive forces shaping human decision-making and self-perception. Cognitive dissonance is the mental tension that arises when we hold two contradictory thoughts, values, or attitudes simultaneously, or when our actions directly conflict with our deeply held beliefs. The mind finds this state profoundly uncomfortable, so uncomfortable that we are willing to employ remarkable mental gymnastics to restore a sense of internal harmony and consistency. Rather than changing the problematic behavior, which would require effort and sacrifice, we often restructure our beliefs, minimize the importance of the contradiction, seek out information that supports our actions, or simply avoid thinking about the inconsistency altogether. We downgrade the significance of our stated values. We selectively attend to evidence that confirms we are still good people despite our hypocritical actions, and we become extraordinarily skilled at rationalization. What makes this pattern so remarkable is that we do all of this while maintaining a genuine sense of integrity and honesty about ourselves, because our minds are designed to protect our self-image at almost any cost, and cognitive dissonance reduction mechanisms operate largely outside our conscious awareness. We live within this constant hum of contradiction, resolving it not through alignment, but through mental reframing. Imagine yourself reading a gripping novel late into the evening, and just as the protagonist reaches a critical decision point, you set the book down to sleep, fully expecting to forget about it by morning. Yet when you wake, the unresolved tension remains vivid in your mind, nagging at you throughout the day until you pick the book back up. This phenomenon extends far beyond literature into nearly every domain of human experience. You find yourself unable to stop thinking about an argument that ended without resolution, or a text message that was left unread, or a project at work that was paused mid-workflow. Your mind seems almost compelled to return to these incomplete tasks and unfinished conversations, cycling through them repeatedly as though seeking closure that has not yet arrived. This is the Zeigarnik Effect, a psychological tendency discovered by Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s, wherein people remember unfinished or interrupted tasks significantly better than completed ones. The mechanism underlying this effect appears to operate through the brain's natural orientation toward goals and completion. When you engage with a task, your mind creates what cognitive scientists call a cognitive frame, an internal representation of that task's beginning, middle, and anticipated end state. When the task remains incomplete, this frame persists in an open state within your working memory, creating a kind of unresolved tension that demands cognitive resources and attention. The brain, it seems, treats unfinished business as a priority, maintaining heightened activation in the neural networks associated with that task until it reaches a satisfactory conclusion. What makes this effect particularly intriguing is how thoroughly it governs human behavior despite our intellectual awareness of it. We know that cliffhangers in television programs are intentionally designed to exploit this tendency, yet we continue to watch them. Advertisers deliberately interrupt their messages mid-sentence or mid-narrative to ensure we remember them better than we would if they provided complete information. Imagine sitting across from someone you care about, convinced that your thoughts, feelings, and inner emotional state are far more visible to them than they actually are. And imagine, too, that you believe their mental landscape is equally legible to you despite the fact that you are separated by the impenetrable barrier of individual consciousness itself. This is the illusion of transparency, and it manifests constantly in human relationships where we overestimate how much others understand about our interior lives, while simultaneously overestimating our own ability to read the minds and hearts of those around us. A person might feel deeply hurt or anxious about something, carrying this weight visibly in their posture and tone, yet genuinely believe they are hiding it well, unaware that their emotional state is broadcasting itself through 1,000 microexpressions and subtle shifts in behavior that observers cannot help but notice. Conversely, this same person will look at a friend's distant demeanor and construct an entire narrative about rejection or anger, when in reality that friend was simply lost in thoughts about work or hunger or an unrelated concern entirely. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through the asymmetry of information access and the egocentric bias that colors human perception. We have complete access to our own thoughts and feelings, making them feel obvious and apparent to us, so it feels almost impossible that others would not perceive what seems so transparent from our internal vantage point. At the same time, we cannot access anyone else's mind directly, yet we fill that gap with assumptions and projections based on limited external data. We persist in this double misconception despite its transparent logical flaw, because the human mind simply cannot operate otherwise without constant cognitive effort and self-correction. And we have evolved to make quick judgments and assumptions rather than to pause and acknowledge the fundamental limits of our knowledge of other people. Imagine walking into a crowded coffee shop wearing a shirt with a small stain on it, and immediately you feel as though every eye in the room has locked onto that imperfection, cataloging your flaw, making silent judgments about your appearance and your worth as a person. You spend the next hour acutely aware of this blemish, convinced that strangers are thinking about it far more than they are thinking about their own coffee orders or their own insecurities. This experience is so common, so universally felt, that we rarely stop to consider how extraordinary it actually is, the belief that we are perpetually the center of other people's attention and concern. The spotlight effect is the tendency we all share to overestimate the degree to which other people notice, care about, and remember our appearance, our mistakes, our vulnerabilities, and our social missteps. When we trip walking down the street, we feel certain that witnesses have filed this moment away in their permanent memory, yet the truth is far gentler. Most people in that moment were thinking about their own problems, their own destinations, their own internal narratives that have nothing to do with us whatsoever. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in a fundamental asymmetry in human consciousness. We have direct, continuous access to our own thoughts, feelings, and perceived flaws, while we have only limited, external access to the minds of others. Because our own insecurities are so vivid and present to us, we assume they must be equally vivid to everyone else, a kind of naive projection of our inner world onto theirs. We forget that other people's attentional capacities are largely consumed by their own internal spotlight, their own worries and self-consciousness, their own perceived inadequacies that feel urgent and important only to them. Imagine you have just finished a conversation with someone new, perhaps at a social gathering or in a professional setting, and you leave the interaction feeling uncertain about whether the other person truly enjoyed talking with you. You replay the conversation in your mind, second-guessing your jokes, wondering if you talked too much or not enough, convinced that the other person probably found you boring or awkward or unremarkable in some way. Meanwhile, that other person is walking away from the exact same conversation, feeling remarkably similar thoughts about you, convinced that you likely did not enjoy speaking with them as much as they secretly hoped you might. This phenomenon is known as the liking gap, and it describes the consistent tendency that people have to systematically underestimate how much others like them, while simultaneously overestimating how much they themselves are liked by others in their own self-perception. The mechanism driving this paradox rests primarily on what psychologists call asymmetry of information and the curse of knowledge. When you are engaged in a conversation, You have full access to your own internal experience, including every moment of self-doubt, every awkward thought that crosses your mind, every instance where you felt you said something stupid or inappropriate. You notice when you stumble over your words or when there is an uncomfortable silence. The other person, however, only observes your external behavior and cannot access this rich internal landscape of your insecurity and self-criticism. They see you as you appear to them, not as you experience yourself. Consequently, you attribute their polite responses and apparent engagement to them being kind rather than genuinely interested, while you attribute any signs of their own nervousness or social awkwardness to them not liking you very much. The persistence of the liking gap is particularly fascinating because it remains stubbornly resistant to logic and experience. Consider the moment when two people find themselves in a genuinely dangerous situation together, perhaps trapped in a stalled elevator or navigating a frightening experience like a horror film screening in a dark theater. And afterward, they discover themselves drawn to one another in ways that feel surprisingly intense and meaningful. What has occurred in this moment is a fundamental misreading of their own internal states, where the physical sensations generated by fear, adrenaline, and heightened physiological arousal become unconsciously reinterpreted as attraction, connection, or romantic interest toward the person who happened to be present during that activation. The heart races from genuine danger, the palms sweat from anxiety, the breathing quickens from stress, yet the mind observes these signals and searches for meaning. And in the absence of full awareness about their true origin, it reaches toward the most salient person in the environment and attributes those sensations to their presence rather than to the situation itself. This psychological mechanism emerged from a reasonable evolutionary logic where physical arousal often did correlate with threat or opportunity that required another person. Yet in modern contexts, it has become decoupled from its original purpose and now operates as a consistent source of misunderstanding about our own emotional states. We watch people fall intensely in love during adventure activities, during stressful work projects, during periods of conflict and reconciliation, and we accept these as authentic expressions of genuine affection without recognizing that the body's arousal system has simply misattributed its signals, packaging up the neurochemistry of excitement and fear and delivering it to us labeled as something it is not. Imagine a person who has spent years working toward a specific goal, perhaps saving money for their dream house, and after months of effort and sacrifice, they finally purchase it, moving through the front door with a sense of profound accomplishment and joy that feels as though it will last forever. Within weeks, however, that extraordinary happiness fades into the background of everyday life, and the house that once seemed like the ultimate source of satisfaction becomes simply the place where they live, no longer triggering the intense positive emotions it once did. This person then finds themselves identifying a new goal, a new acquisition, a new achievement that they believe will finally bring them lasting happiness, only to experience the same pattern repeating itself when they attain it. This is the hedonic treadmill, one of the most pervasive and consequential patterns in human psychology, wherein we rapidly adapt to positive changes in our circumstances and return to our baseline level of happiness regardless of what we obtain or achieve. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in our evolutionary adaptation system, which helped our ancestors survive by allowing them to quickly adjust to new environmental conditions and remain alert to threats and opportunities rather than becoming complacent with their circumstances. Our brains are fundamentally designed to notice changes, to react to novelty, and then to normalize that novelty as quickly as possible so that we can redirect our attention to the next potential danger or opportunity. The same neural pathways that protected our ancestors by keeping them vigilant now work against us in modern life, creating a perpetual cycle where no amount of external achievement, material possession, or life circumstance change produces lasting increases in our subjective well-being. Imagine a child who loves to draw, spending hours creating colorful pictures and illustrations with genuine enthusiasm and intrinsic joy. But then one day a parent decides to reward them with money or prizes each time they produce artwork, believing this will encourage more creativity and productivity. What happens over time is counterintuitive and striking. The child begins to draw less frequently, the drawings become less imaginative, and when the rewards eventually stop, the child loses interest in drawing altogether, treating it as a chore rather than a source of pleasure. This phenomenon is the Overjustification Effect, a psychological mechanism where external rewards, incentives, or justifications for an activity paradoxically diminish our intrinsic motivation to perform that activity. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through a cognitive reframing process where our minds unconsciously attribute our behavior to the external incentive rather than to internal desire. When an activity we once did for internal reasons becomes coupled with an external reward, we psychologically reinterpret our motivation, essentially telling ourselves that we perform the behavior because of the reward, not because we genuinely enjoy it. This shift in attribution reduces our perception of personal autonomy and self-determination, which are fundamental psychological needs. Over time, this reattribution becomes consolidated in memory and habit, and even after the external justification disappears, the internal motivation fails to return to its previous levels. The effect persists because we have normalized the practice of using external rewards and incentives across virtually every domain of human life, from education and employment to parenting and relationships, rarely questioning whether these motivators are actually achieving their intended purpose or whether they might be undermining something far more valuable than temporary compliance. There exists a curious phenomenon wherein we find ourselves drawn to things that are imperfect, disorganized, or deliberately flawed, often perceiving them as more authentic, more beautiful, or more compelling than their polished and refined counterparts. Consider the appeal of a sketch over a finished painting, the worn leather of an old jacket preferred over pristine new fabric, or the way we gravitate towards celebrities and public figures who openly acknowledge their mistakes rather than those who maintain an air of unattainable perfection. We find ourselves captivated by the rough edges, the visible struggle, the evidence of human effort and imperfection that marks something as genuinely ours, genuinely real. This effect operates across nearly every domain of human experience, from the way we aesthetically appreciate art to how we form intimate relationships with other people who display their vulnerabilities rather than hide them behind carefully constructed facades. The psychological mechanism underlying this response appears rooted in our fundamental need for authenticity and connection. When something is polished to perfection, it feels distant, untouchable, and perhaps even dishonest in its presentation of an impossible standard that no human can truly embody. Conversely, when we encounter imperfection, flaws, and evidence of the creative or human process, we recognize ourselves within it. We see the truth of existence as lived rather than imagined, and this recognition creates a profound sense of intimacy and belonging. There is also an element of what psychologists call the Pratfall Effect, wherein minor mistakes or vulnerabilities actually increase likability and perceived competence when displayed by someone already established as capable. Imagine a software engineer sitting down to explain their code to a colleague who has never seen it before, and despite their best intentions, they skip over fundamental concepts because these basics have become so deeply embedded in their own mind that they no longer register as knowledge that needs to be communicated, only to find their colleague utterly bewildered by terms and connections that seem obvious to them but remain entirely invisible to the listener. This phenomenon, known as the curse of knowledge, describes our profound inability to remember what it felt like not to know something once we have learned it, creating an invisible barrier between experts and novices that persists regardless of how patient or well-intentioned the expert might be. When we acquire knowledge or skill, it becomes integrated into our cognitive framework so completely that we lose access to the mental state we inhabited before that knowledge existed, much like we cannot truly remember what colors looked like before we learned their names, or what it felt like to be unable to read when we now process written language automatically. The mechanism underlying this paradox emerges from how human memory works. Once information becomes sufficiently consolidated and automatized through repeated use, it moves from our conscious working memory into implicit or procedural memory, where it operates below the threshold of awareness. And this shift actually represents cognitive efficiency because our brains have optimized these processes to require minimal conscious attention, freeing up mental resources for new learning. However, this same optimization that makes us capable experts simultaneously makes us incapable of accessing the step-by-step thinking we once performed, creating a strange asymmetry where the very mastery that should position us best to teach others actually distances us from understanding what their confusion might be, and we find ourselves wondering why our crystal-clear explanations fail to illuminate anything for our audience. Imagine a surgeon who has successfully performed hundreds of operations with excellent outcomes, yet believes that one day soon their colleagues will discover they have no idea what they are doing. Picture a published author with multiple books in print who feels certain that their success is merely luck and that they will inevitably be exposed as a fraud. Consider the accomplished executive who attributes their promotions entirely to timing and coincidence rather than their own competence and leadership abilities. These individuals have tangible evidence of their capabilities, measurable proof of their professional standing, and objective recognition from their peers. Yet they maintain a persistent internal conviction that they are fundamentally unqualified and that discovery of their inadequacy is imminent. This is imposter syndrome, a psychological experience where accomplished people systematically discount their own achievements and attribute their success to external factors beyond their control. The mechanism operates through a selective attention bias where individuals hyperfocus on their mistakes, gaps in knowledge, or instances where they struggled, while completely discounting or minimizing their successes, skills, and the problems they have solved. They compare their internal experience of uncertainty and self-doubt to the external accomplishments of others, a fundamentally asymmetrical comparison since they never have direct access to other people's private doubts and insecurities. What makes this paradox particularly striking is that imposter syndrome often intensifies precisely when someone achieves greater recognition or advancement, as if external validation somehow proves the illegitimacy of their position rather than confirming their competence. Imagine scrolling through your news feed and encountering a headline about a natural disaster that has claimed the lives of 100 people in a distant country, and you pause for a moment, feel a brief sadness, and then continue scrolling to see what your friends had for lunch. Then imagine encountering a news story about a single child who fell into a well, and you find yourself riveted, sharing the story, donating money, and checking for updates throughout the day. The disparity in our emotional response to these two scenarios reveals a profound phenomenon that psychologists call psychic numbing, a tendency of human beings to respond with diminishing emotional intensity as the magnitude of a tragedy increases. When confronted with large-scale suffering, our capacity for empathy appears to shut down like a dimmer switch turned lower and lower with each additional victim, whereas individual stories of suffering activate our full emotional apparatus in ways that seem almost disproportionate to the actual scale of harm. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to be rooted in the limitations of human imagination and emotional processing itself. Our minds evolved to navigate small tribal communities where we could comprehend and emotionally connect with a finite number of individuals, and this ancient architecture struggles when asked to process abstract statistics about thousands or millions of people. A single person becomes a complete human being in our minds, a fully realized story with hopes and dreams and a distinct identity, while 1,000 becomes merely a number, a statistic too large to truly visualize or emotionally inhabit. We experience what researchers call the collapse of compassion, where the emotional weight of human suffering does not scale proportionally with the actual number of people affected, creating a bizarre inversion where one death feels more tragic than 1,000. Consider the moment you first encounter a humanitarian crisis, perhaps through a news report about a devastating earthquake in a distant country that has claimed thousands of lives, and you feel a profound surge of emotional response, a genuine desire to help, a weight in your chest that compels you toward action and donation. But then, as weeks pass and the same crisis continues to dominate the headlines, as the numbers remain large and the suffering persists without resolution, something curious happens to that initial emotional intensity. The visceral pain you felt begins to diminish, not because the situation has improved, but precisely because it has remained unchanged, static, absorbing the full force of human attention without yielding to narrative closure. This phenomenon, known as compassion fade, reveals something troubling about the architecture of human empathy itself. We are neurologically wired to respond to novelty, to change, to stories with beginnings and endings, and when a tragedy becomes chronic rather than acute, when it transforms from an event into a condition, our emotional systems essentially downregulate, treating the persistent suffering as background noise rather than a call to action. The psychological mechanism operates through a process called habituation, wherein repeated exposure to the same stimulus produces a diminished neural response, a dulling of the signal that once felt urgent and unmissable. Furthermore, our empathy is constrained by what researchers call the identifiable victim effect, meaning we feel far more compassion for individual named specific people than for statistical abstractions of mass suffering. So when a crisis becomes merely a number, a percentage, a generalized description of collective pain, it loses its emotional grip on our consciousness. What makes this paradox so persistently troubling is that the logical structure of compassion should operate in precisely the opposite direction. Imagine two scenarios unfolding before you with equal moral weight. In the first, you are shown a photograph of a single child named Maya, age 7, who needs a medical treatment that costs $5,000 to survive a rare disease, and you are told her story, her favorite color, the way she draws pictures of her family. In the second scenario, you are presented with statistics indicating that thousands of children across an entire region lack access to basic medical care, and without intervention, many will not reach adulthood. Most people, when faced with these two presentations of human suffering, will feel a far stronger emotional pull toward donating money to save Maya than toward the abstract crisis affecting thousands. This is the identifiable victim effect, a profound and consistent pattern in human psychology that reveals something deeply unsettling about how we assign value to human life. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through the human brain's preference for concrete information over abstract data. When we encounter a specific individual with a name, a face, a personal history, our emotional centers activate in ways that statistics simply cannot trigger, no matter how large those numbers become. The brain treats identifiable victims as real in a way that abstract populations do not feel real, and this realness creates emotional resonance that drives action and compassion. We form what psychologists call an identifiable victim effect because our evolutionary heritage shaped us to care deeply about known members of our community, about the specific child we can see and name, rather than about distant and numerous strangers whose faces we will never know. This ancient wiring served us well when human societies were small, when resources were limited, and when every member of the tribe mattered for survival. Yet in our modern world, where we have the capacity to help vast numbers of people we will never meet, this same psychological mechanism leads us to systematically neglect the greater good in favor of the compelling singularity of one identifiable person. Imagine a person who donates $50 to a charity on a Tuesday morning, and then later that same week, when faced with an opportunity to volunteer at a local food bank, they decline, telling themselves they have already done their part for those in need, at least for now. Or consider the individual who purchases organic, fair trade coffee at premium prices, feeling virtuous about their environmental consciousness, only to drive their gas-guzzling SUV home without a second thought about their carbon footprint. These are examples of moral licensing, a psychological phenomenon where performing a positive moral action actually grants us permission, in our own minds, to subsequently engage in behaviors that contradict our values or harm others. The mechanism works through a process of self-perception and internal accounting. When we perform an action we perceive as morally good, our brain updates its internal narrative about who we are and what kind of person we represent. This updated self-image then creates what psychologists call a moral credit account, where we feel we have earned the right to be less virtuous in other domains or situations. The paradox deepens when we recognize that this process happens almost entirely beneath our conscious awareness, and yet it fundamentally shapes our choices and our impact on the world around us. We continue to engage in this self-deceptive accounting system despite having no logical foundation for it, because our brains are not designed to maintain perfect consistency across all our behaviors and values. Instead, our minds prioritize self-image maintenance and psychological comfort, allowing us to feel good about ourselves while simultaneously engaging in contradictory actions. This normalization of moral licensing persists because it operates quietly, without fanfare, and because we rarely examine our own motivations closely enough to catch ourselves in the act of granting ourselves unearned permission. Imagine you are negotiating to purchase a house that you have admired for months, a property that seemed perfect in every way, offering everything you desired at a price you thought was reasonable. Then, unexpectedly, another buyer emerges and expresses serious interest, threatening to outbid you for the same home. In that moment, something peculiar happens within your mind. The house suddenly seems less desirable than it did before, its flaws become more apparent, and you find yourself questioning whether you ever truly wanted it at all. You begin to notice the aging roof you overlooked previously, the cramped kitchen that now feels entirely inadequate, and the neighborhood noise that somehow went unheard during your earlier visits. This phenomenon, known as reactive devaluation, describes our tendency to diminish the value of something we desire simply because we discover that others desire it as well, or because it becomes less available to us than before. The psychological mechanism underlying this pattern operates through several interconnected processes. First, when we perceive that something is contested or scarce, we unconsciously interpret this competition as evidence that the object may not be as valuable as we initially believed, since surely if it were truly exceptional, we would have secured it already. Second, losing control or exclusivity over a desired item triggers a defensive psychological response, wherein we protect our self-esteem by retroactively deciding that we did not want it as much as we thought we did. Third, the sudden introduction of competition introduces cognitive dissonance between our initial assessment and the new social information, which we resolve by changing our evaluation rather than increasing our effort. What makes reactive devaluation particularly remarkable is that it persists despite its logical irrationality. The objective qualities of the house have not changed, yet our subjective assessment has shifted dramatically based purely on external circumstances. Imagine a driver who purchases a new car equipped with advanced safety features, including anti-lock brakes, electronic stability control, and multiple airbags. One might reasonably expect that this driver would feel safer and therefore drive more cautiously, taking fewer risks on the road. Yet what frequently happens instead is almost paradoxical. The driver, feeling more protected by these safety innovations, begins to drive more aggressively, speeds up in challenging weather conditions, and takes corners at faster velocities than they would have in an older vehicle without such protections. This counterintuitive behavioral shift is the essence of the Peltzman Effect, named after economist Sam Peltzman, who first observed and documented this phenomenon in 1975. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through a concept known as risk compensation or risk homeostasis, suggesting that individuals maintain a relatively stable internal target level of perceived risk throughout their daily activities. When external safety measures reduce the actual danger present in an activity, people unconsciously recalibrate their behavior to restore their sense of risk back to their baseline preference, essentially negating the protective benefit that the safety measure was designed to provide. This occurs not necessarily through conscious deliberation, but rather through subtle shifts in attention, decision-making, and behavioral choices that accumulate over time. The paradox becomes even more striking when we recognize that this effect applies across numerous domains beyond automobile safety, including sports equipment, workplace protections, and medical interventions. Athletes wearing better protective gear in contact sports often report increased confidence that translates into more reckless play, thereby offsetting injury reductions that the equipment might otherwise provide. Workers in hazardous environments may become complacent when provided with superior protective equipment, leading to risky behaviors that the equipment was intended to guard against. Imagine a frog placed in a pot of water at room temperature, and imagine that the heat beneath that pot is turned up gradually, so slowly that the increase in temperature is nearly imperceptible from one moment to the next. The frog, sensing only marginal changes in its environment, never experiences a single moment that feels urgent or dangerous enough to justify the effort of escape, and so it remains in the water as the temperature climbs incrementally toward lethal levels. By the time the water reaches a temperature that would cause the frog to jump away immediately if it had been placed there directly, the frog has already lost the capacity to respond, having normalized each tiny shift along the way. This is not merely a biological phenomenon, but a profound metaphor for how human beings process gradual change, particularly change that threatens their well-being or autonomy. We encounter this pattern repeatedly in our personal lives, in relationships that slowly become toxic through accumulated small betrayals rather than dramatic events, in work environments where conditions deteriorate so incrementally that we hardly notice we have become miserable, in our own health habits where one skipped workout becomes many and one indulgence becomes routine. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our reliance on contrast and comparison as tools for noticing change. Our brains are exquisitely sensitive to sudden shifts, but remarkably insensitive to gradients, to slow movements across a landscape we thought was stable. We have adapted over evolutionary time to notice the predator that appears suddenly in the clearing, but not the slow creep of danger that respects the pace of our habituation. Furthermore, we possess a powerful rationalization capacity that allows us to construct reasonable explanations for each small step, each minor compromise, each subtle degradation. We tell ourselves the relationship has always been this way, the job has always been this difficult, our bodies have always felt this tired. Imagine you are a physician in the 19th century, standing in a hospital ward filled with women suffering from childbed fever, a mysterious and devastating infection that kills countless new mothers every year. And a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis notices something remarkable in the data. When doctors wash their hands with chlorinated lime solution before attending to patients, the mortality rate from this terrible disease drops dramatically, falling from over 18% to less than 2%, a finding so profound that it should revolutionize medical practice overnight and save countless lives. Yet instead of embracing this discovery with gratitude and implementing these simple hygiene measures immediately, the medical establishment of his time rejects his findings vehemently, dismisses his evidence as impossible, and ostracizes him professionally, ultimately leading to his own tragic institutionalization and death, a phenomenon that would come to be known as the Semmelweis Reflex, which describes our tendency to reject new evidence or knowledge because it contradicts established norms, deeply held beliefs, or the status quo that we have constructed our professional identities and social hierarchies around. The psychological mechanism underlying this reflex operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There is cognitive dissonance, where accepting the new information would require acknowledging that our previous practices were harmful, that our training was incomplete, and that our expertise is not infallible, feelings that threaten our sense of competence and self-worth. There is also social identity protection, where challenging established medical doctrine means challenging the entire profession itself and risking ostracization from our peers and colleagues upon whom we depend for validation, reputation, and professional opportunity. Additionally, there is the simple human resistance to change, the comfort we find in familiar patterns, and the emotional labor required to fundamentally reorganize our understanding of how the world works. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room with a fortune teller who tells you that you have a great need for other people to like and admire you, yet you tend to be critical of yourself, and while you present a confident exterior to the world, you harbor deep insecurities beneath the surface. You nod slowly, feeling seen and understood in ways that seem impossibly accurate and specific to your inner life. Yet the fortune teller has offered descriptions so generalized and universally applicable that they could describe nearly every human being who has ever lived. And indeed, this same script has been delivered to thousands of people before you and thousands more after you will hear nearly identical words. This phenomenon is known as the Barnum Effect, named after the famous circus showman Phineas Taylor Barnum, who understood perhaps better than anyone the human tendency to find personal meaning in vague and general statements. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through several interrelated psychological processes that work in concert to create the illusion of specificity and insight. First, there exists a powerful confirmation bias that causes us to selectively attend to information that confirms what we already believe about ourselves, while ignoring or dismissing information that contradicts our self-concept. When presented with a vague statement, we unconsciously fill in the gaps with our own experiences and memories, essentially co-creating the meaning rather than passively receiving it. Additionally, the mere presence of an authority figure, whether a fortune teller, astrologer, or personality assessment, lends credibility and weight to statements that would otherwise seem trivial or obvious. We are culturally conditioned to believe that trained professionals possess special insight into human nature, and this expectation colors our interpretation of their words. The effect persists despite its fundamental illogic, because the human mind desperately seeks meaning and connection, and we are far more motivated to find validation than to acknowledge that we have been fooled. Consider a teacher who is told at the beginning of the academic year that certain students in their classroom have been identified as high achievers with exceptional potential for intellectual growth, when in reality, these students were selected completely at random. By the end of that year, those randomly selected students show significantly greater gains in their test scores and IQ measurements compared to their peers, and they are rated by their teachers as being more intellectually curious, better adjusted, and more likely to succeed in life. This phenomenon, named after the mythological sculptor who fell in love with his own creation and brought it to life through sheer force of belief, reveals something profound about how our expectations literally reshape the people around us. The mechanism operates through a series of subtle behavioral shifts that accumulate over time without anyone consciously recognizing what is happening. Teachers who believe certain students are destined for excellence begin to treat those students differently in countless small ways. They call on them more frequently, they wait longer for them to answer questions, they give them more specific and constructive feedback, they make more eye contact, and they smile at them more often. These students in turn internalize the message that they are capable and intelligent, and they begin to work harder, ask more questions, and take greater intellectual risks because they trust that their efforts will be rewarded. The teacher's belief creates a self-fulfilling prophecy that requires no deception on anyone's part, yet it persists as a powerful force in educational and professional contexts everywhere despite our modern understanding of how it works. We continue to unconsciously communicate our expectations to others through tone of voice, body language, and the frequency and quality of our interactions, and those expectations become embedded in their self-concept and their actual performance, making belief itself a tool that shapes reality in ways that logic alone cannot explain. Imagine a classroom where a teacher has been told that certain students are low achievers, that their potential is limited, that they will likely struggle with advanced concepts and fall behind their peers. The teacher approaches these students with subtle shifts in behavior, less eye contact, fewer chances to speak, simpler questions, less wait time for responses, and a general demeanor that communicates lowered expectations. Over the course of weeks and months, something remarkable and deeply troubling happens. These students who were actually of average ability begin to perform worse than their peers. Their test scores decline, their confidence erodes, and their actual academic performance transforms to match the expectations that were placed upon them, despite those expectations being entirely fabricated. This phenomenon is called the Golem Effect, the dark inverse of the famous Pygmalion Effect, demonstrating that low expectations can become self-fulfilling prophecies just as powerfully as high ones. The mechanism operates through several interconnected psychological pathways. When authority figures hold low expectations, they communicate these beliefs through countless microbehaviors that students unconsciously detect and internalize. The reduced feedback, the tone of voice, the body language, the quality of instruction offered, all of these accumulate into a message that says you are not capable. Students then adjust their self-perception and effort accordingly, gradually accepting the role that has been assigned to them. Over time, their actual abilities begin to atrophy from lack of challenge and encouragement, creating a tragic convergence where the false belief becomes reality. What makes this particularly insidious is how invisible the process remains to both parties. The teacher genuinely believes they are simply responding to objective differences in student ability, while the students have no awareness that their own performance is being constrained by external expectations rather than their actual potential. Imagine a student who has been told repeatedly by teachers and parents that they are not mathematically inclined, that numbers simply do not make sense to them, that they lack the necessary aptitude for algebra or geometry. This belief settles into their mind like sediment in still water, becoming a foundational truth about who they are. When they sit down to study mathematics, they approach the subject with a quiet resignation, a pre-existing conviction that failure is inevitable. They spend less time on practice problems because effort feels futile. When they encounter a difficult concept, they do not persist through confusion the way their confident peers do. Instead, they interpret struggle as confirmation of their inherent inability. The anxiety they feel during exams actually impairs their cognitive performance, a biological reality where stress narrows attention and disrupts working memory. When they inevitably perform poorly on the test, they see not a variable outcome dependent on preparation and effort, but rather evidence that the original prophecy was accurate all along. The failure becomes confirmation rather than contradiction, and the belief grows stronger, more calcified, more resistant to challenge. This cycle perpetuates itself with almost mechanical precision. The fascinating paradox lies in the fact that the original prophecy contained no inherent truth whatsoever, yet through the architecture of our own beliefs and behaviors, we construct the very reality we fear or expect. Our minds do not passively receive the world, they actively shape it through expectation. This mechanism persists because we mistake correlation for causation, interpreting outcomes as proof of our nature rather than recognizing them as products of our actions and choices. We have normalized this psychological structure so thoroughly that we rarely question whether our beliefs about ourselves are discoveries or creations, whether we are uncovering facts or manufacturing them through the sheer force of expectation and subsequent behavior. Consider a scenario in which a student from an underrepresented group sits down to take a challenging mathematics test, and just before the exam begins, they are casually reminded through conversation or environmental cues that their demographic group is typically not as strong in mathematics as others, or they are simply made aware that their performance will be evaluated in a domain where negative stereotypes about their group exist. What unfolds in that moment is not a simple transfer of information, but rather a complex cascade of psychological events that fundamentally alters their cognitive capacity and test performance. This phenomenon, known as stereotype threat, occurs when individuals become acutely conscious of negative stereotypes about their social group in a particular domain, and this awareness creates a state of heightened anxiety and cognitive load that actively impairs their ability to perform in that very domain. The mechanism operates through several interconnected pathways. First, the awareness of the stereotype triggers emotional stress and physiological arousal, which consumes working memory resources that would otherwise be devoted to solving problems or recalling information. Second, the individual may unconsciously adopt self-protective strategies, such as disidentifying with the domain or suppressing thoughts about the stereotype, both of which paradoxically increase cognitive effort and depletion. Third, the stereotype activates negative self-doubt and performance-related anxiety that directly interferes with attention and concentration, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where the very threat of confirming the stereotype causes the performance decrements that the stereotype predicted. What makes this paradox particularly striking is that stereotype threat can emerge in virtually any performance domain and affects individuals across all demographic groups, depending on the specific stereotype salient in that context. Yet we continue to interpret performance differences as evidence of actual group differences in ability rather than as evidence of the situational psychological forces at work. Imagine a patient sitting in a doctor's office who has just been handed a prescription slip, and as the physician begins explaining the medication, they mention in passing that some people experience dizziness, nausea, or headaches as side effects. The patient nods, takes the medication home, and within hours begins to feel dizzy and nauseated, convinced that their body is reacting to the chemical compound they have ingested. Yet what if the pill they were given was actually a placebo, a completely inert substance with no active ingredients whatsoever? This is the Nocebo Effect, the dark mirror of the Placebo Effect, where negative expectations about a treatment or substance cause a person to actually experience harmful symptoms despite receiving nothing that should produce those symptoms. The mechanism operates through the same neurobiological pathways as the placebo effect, but in reverse, where the brain's anticipation of suffering creates genuine physiological responses that feel entirely real to the person experiencing them. When we expect to feel sick, our nervous system can actually trigger the very symptoms we fear, releasing stress hormones, altering pain perception, and even affecting immune function through the intricate connections between mind and body. What makes this phenomenon particularly persistent in human psychology is how deeply we trust the authority of medical professionals and how readily we accept their warnings as predictive of our own experience. We have normalized the idea that negative expectations are simply realistic preparation, when in fact they become self-fulfilling prophecies that generate suffering where none need exist. The Nocebo Effect reveals how powerfully our beliefs shape our biology, and how the simple act of expecting to feel bad can convince our bodies to comply with that expectation, demonstrating that our minds possess the capacity to harm ourselves just as thoroughly as they can heal us. Consider the patient who receives a sugar pill disguised as an advanced pharmaceutical treatment, and within days reports a genuine reduction in pain, improvement in fatigue, or lessening of anxiety symptoms, even though the substance itself contains no active medicinal properties whatsoever. The placebo effect represents one of the most profound paradoxes in human psychology and medicine, because it demonstrates that our beliefs about healing can literally alter our physiological state and produce measurable biological changes. When we expect something to work, our brain initiates a cascade of neurochemical responses that trigger the release of endorphins, dopamine, and other neurotransmitters that reduce pain perception and enhance mood and immune function. The expectation itself becomes the medicine, and the mind becomes the pharmacy, dispensing genuine healing benefits based entirely on what we believe will happen to our bodies rather than what is actually happening chemically. What makes this phenomenon particularly paradoxical is that it persists and remains effective even when we are consciously aware of its illusory nature. Research has shown that placebos continue to work even when patients are told explicitly that they are receiving inert substances with no active ingredients, which suggests that the power lies not in deception, but in the deeper human capacity for belief and the intricate connection between expectation and physiology. We have normalized this seeming impossibility by incorporating placebos into medical practice itself, using them as the control condition against which we measure real treatments, yet rarely acknowledging that the placebo condition itself is producing real healing outcomes. The placebo effect endures because it touches something fundamental about human consciousness, revealing that the boundary between mind and body is far more permeable than we typically acknowledge, and that expectation, ritual, environment, and the therapeutic relationship can generate authentic biological benefits that rival the effects of pharmaceutical interventions. Imagine you are a factory worker in the 1920s, performing your routine tasks on an assembly line with dozens of others, and one day you notice that researchers have arrived with clipboards and observational equipment to study your productivity and work habits. Without any changes to your actual working conditions, your output increases. Your colleagues notice the same phenomenon. Everyone begins working slightly harder, moving with more purpose, paying closer attention to the quality of their work, simply because they know they are being watched and measured. This is the Hawthorne Effect, named after the Western Electric Hawthorne Works factory where the original studies took place, and it reveals something fundamental about human behavior that persists across every domain of modern life. The mechanism is straightforward in its elegance. When people become aware that their behavior is under observation or evaluation, they modify their conduct in ways they believe are more socially desirable or aligned with perceived expectations, regardless of whether those changes are actually necessary or beneficial. This is not conscious deception, but rather an automatic adjustment to the social context, a deeply ingrained response to being watched that operates below the threshold of deliberate decision-making. The paradox deepens when we consider that this effect persists even when we intellectually understand it is happening, even when we tell ourselves that we should not change our behavior simply because an observer is present. Students perform better on exams when they believe their work will be reviewed by impressive evaluators. Employees adopt safer practices on factory floors when safety inspectors are scheduled to visit. Patients report improved symptoms during medical consultations compared to their actual day-to-day experiences. The moment you become aware that someone is watching you, something fundamental shifts in your behavior, and this transformation happens so automatically that you rarely notice it occurring at all. Consider the person who walks differently when they know they are being observed, who speaks with different inflection when aware of an audience, or who suddenly becomes more conscious of their posture and appearance the instant they catch someone's eye across a room. The observer effect in psychology describes this peculiar human tendency to alter our actions, thoughts, and presentations simply because we are conscious of being perceived by another person or even by ourselves through an imagined lens. This phenomenon operates across nearly every dimension of human existence, from the most trivial social interactions to the deepest expressions of our authentic selves. When you study for an examination alone in your room, your focus might wander and your motivation may fluctuate. But place that same student in a testing center with a proctor watching over them, and suddenly their concentration sharpens and their behavior becomes more deliberate and controlled. The psychologist becomes aware that their very presence in the therapy session influences what the patient reveals, and the anthropologist realizes that their documentation of a culture fundamentally alters the behaviors they are attempting to record in their natural state. What makes this paradox so intellectually fascinating is that we have normalized this distortion as simply how humans naturally function, rather than recognizing it as a profound interference with authentic human expression. We accept that we present different versions of ourselves depending on who is watching, yet we simultaneously cling to the notion that there exists some core, unchanging self beneath all these observed layers. Consider two people who begin their relationship in circumstances marked by opposition, conflict, or disapproval from those around them. A couple whose families disapprove, or whose social circles are fundamentally opposed, or whose very union is deemed forbidden by external forces, often finds their emotional bond intensifying rather than weakening under this pressure. The relationship becomes more passionate, more consuming, more central to their identities precisely because the world around them works against it. What might have been a casual romantic connection transforms into something that feels transcendent, inevitable, and deeply meaningful. They spend more time together to compensate for the isolation imposed upon them. They invest more emotional energy into defending their choice. They view their love as a form of rebellion, a proof of commitment that supersedes all logical consideration. The relationship becomes not simply a partnership but a statement, a declaration of autonomy against a hostile world. This phenomenon, drawn from Shakespeare's tragic lovers, reveals something profound about human psychology that operates beneath our conscious awareness. When external forces restrict our access to something we desire, the brain registers this restriction as a loss of freedom, triggering what psychologists call reactance. This reactance causes us to value the restricted object more highly than we would have valued it otherwise. The forbidden element doesn't make the relationship itself better or more compatible, but it makes us feel the relationship more intensely. The opposition becomes the very fuel that burns brighter. We have normalized this paradox so thoroughly that we barely question why forbidden love appears more romantic in our stories and our hearts than freely chosen love. We celebrate the couple who defies their families while rarely examining whether that defiance has actually improved their compatibility or life satisfaction. Imagine a teenager being told by their parents that a particular website is absolutely off-limits, that they cannot visit it under any circumstances, that it is forbidden territory in their household. Within days, that teenager becomes consumed with curiosity about this very website, devoting considerable mental energy to wondering what could possibly be so dangerous or inappropriate that it warranted such a severe restriction. The restriction itself becomes the primary source of the website's appeal, transforming what might have been a forgettable corner of the internet into something that feels precious, dangerous, and irresistibly desirable. This is the forbidden fruit effect in its purest form, and it operates across nearly every domain of human experience, from romance to food, to information to material possessions. When we are explicitly told that something is unavailable or restricted, our brains do not respond with rational acceptance of that limitation. Instead, we experience a profound surge in desire for the very thing we cannot have. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears rooted in our psychological relationship with autonomy and control. When restrictions are imposed externally, they trigger what psychologists call reactance, a motivational state that arises when we perceive a threat to our freedom or our sense of agency. Our minds interpret the prohibition not as a helpful boundary, but as an infringement on our right to choose, and this perceived loss of freedom becomes the catalyst for heightened wanting. The more forcefully something is forbidden, the more intensely we may crave it, because the restriction itself has become evidence that we are being controlled, manipulated, or prevented from accessing something significant. What makes this pattern so persistent and so universal is that it operates largely beneath conscious awareness, driving behavior even when we intellectually understand the irrationality of our response. Consider the moment when a parent tells their teenager not to stay out late, only to discover that the explicit prohibition makes the forbidden activity seem far more desirable and compelling than it ever would have been without the warning. The adolescent feels an almost magnetic pull toward the very thing they have been told to avoid, as though the instruction itself has transformed an ordinary evening into an act of rebellion and independence. This phenomenon, known as reverse psychology, operates on a fundamental principle of human autonomy and reactance, the psychological state that emerges when we perceive our freedom being threatened or restricted by an external force. When someone attempts to control our behavior through direct commands or prohibitions, we often experience an immediate and powerful impulse to do exactly the opposite, not because the forbidden action is inherently more appealing, but because reasserting our sense of agency and freedom becomes the primary motivation. The mechanism reveals something profound about human nature. We are not rational creatures who simply weigh the merits of our choices in isolation, but rather beings deeply invested in maintaining our perception of autonomy and control over our own decisions. This reactive impulse occurs beneath the surface of conscious awareness most of the time, operating automatically without our explicit recognition, which makes it particularly difficult to counteract even when we understand intellectually how it functions. We have normalized this paradoxical response so thoroughly within our social structures that we often deploy reverse psychology deliberately, knowing that telling someone not to do something frequently produces the opposite effect, yet we continue to be surprised and frustrated when others employ this same technique against us. Imagine a parent telling their teenager that they absolutely cannot go to a particular party, that it is completely forbidden, and that there will be severe consequences if they disobey. Within hours, that teenager becomes intensely focused on attending that party, convinced that they must go, feeling a burning need to assert their independence and prove that nobody can control their choices. The party itself may have held only moderate appeal before the prohibition was issued, yet now it occupies the teenager's thoughts almost constantly. This is psychological reactance, a powerful motivational state that emerges whenever we perceive that our freedom of choice has been threatened or restricted, causing us to feel an urgent compulsion to restore that freedom through direct opposition to the restricting force. The mechanism operates through a simple but profound recognition that our sense of autonomy and personal agency feels fundamentally threatened when external forces attempt to dictate our behavior, and we respond by becoming intensely motivated to do exactly the thing we have been told we cannot do. This reactance does not depend on rational evaluation of whether the restriction makes sense or whether the forbidden option was ever truly desirable. Instead, it operates as an automatic emotional and motivational response that floods our psychology whenever we detect an attempt to limit our choices. We see this pattern everywhere in human life. The diet that makes forbidden foods irresistible, the workplace policy that generates resistance simply because it eliminates options, the relationship where jealous restrictions breed attraction to the restricted alternative, and the political movement that gains momentum simply because authorities have attempted to suppress it. Imagine walking into a store and seeing a sign that reads, "Only 3 items left in stock," and suddenly you feel an urgent need to purchase something you had not considered buying moments before. Or perhaps you receive an email from a company stating that an offer expires in 24 hours, and despite having months to make this decision previously, you now feel compelled to act immediately. The scarcity principle describes our deeply ingrained tendency to perceive things as more valuable, more desirable, and more worthy of pursuit when they are rare, limited, or about to become unavailable. This principle operates across nearly every domain of human experience, from consumer behavior to romantic relationships to career opportunities, and it does so with remarkable consistency and power. When we believe something is scarce, our brain automatically assigns it greater importance and worth, triggering urgency, anxiety, and a fear of missing out that can override our rational decision-making processes entirely. The mechanism underlying this principle emerges from our evolutionary past, where resources genuinely were limited and scarcity presented real survival challenges. Our ancestors who quickly recognized and acted upon rare opportunities, whether they were hunting grounds, fertile land, or potential mates, were more likely to survive and reproduce, passing their scarcity-sensitive psychology down through generations. This ancient wiring remains embedded in our neurology today, even though the modern world has fundamentally transformed the nature of scarcity itself. Yet we continue to respond to artificial scarcity and manufactured limitation with the same urgency our ancestors felt when facing genuine survival threats, treating limited edition products, exclusive memberships, and time-sensitive offers as though our very existence depends upon securing them. We have normalized this response so thoroughly that retailers, marketers, and service providers have engineered entire business models around exploiting our scarcity bias, creating artificial constraints that trigger buying behavior in millions of people simultaneously. When someone we are attracted to begins to withdraw their attention or availability, something peculiar happens in the human psyche. We often find ourselves wanting them more intensely than before, even though nothing about their actual character or compatibility with us has changed. This paradox plays out across dating scenarios, social hierarchies, and professional contexts with remarkable consistency, where individuals deliberately make themselves less accessible, less responsive, or less enthusiastic in hopes of increasing their desirability to another person. A person might take hours to respond to messages, cancel plans at the last moment, or express indifference to someone's affections, all while secretly hoping these behaviors will create a sense of scarcity and urgency that drives the other person's pursuit. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon stems from several interconnected psychological principles that operate below conscious awareness. When something becomes less available, our brain registers it as more valuable, a principle known as the Scarcity Principle, which applies to tangible goods and to human attention with equal force. Additionally, we are unconsciously drawn to validate ourselves through the approval of those who seem difficult to please, as if their reluctant affection carries greater weight than enthusiasm freely given. The pursuit itself becomes rewarding, flooding the mind with dopamine during moments of hope and creating an addictive cycle of uncertainty that feels remarkably similar to genuine love. What makes this paradox persist despite its fundamental illogic is that we rarely examine it clearly while we are caught within it. We convince ourselves that playing hard to get is a strategic necessity, a way of testing whether someone's interest is real or shallow, when in reality we are often simply afraid of rejection and using calculated distance as armor. Imagine you have spent an entire Saturday afternoon assembling a bookshelf from flat-pack furniture, following instruction diagrams that offered no words, only cryptic line drawings and the occasional frustrated moment when you realized you had inserted a dowel backward. When the bookshelf is finally complete, standing somewhat unevenly in your living room, you regard it with a sense of accomplishment and pride that seems utterly disproportionate to what you have actually created. You have assembled a simple piece of furniture using pre-manufactured components and standardized instructions available to millions of other people, yet you value this bookshelf far more highly than an identical one you might have purchased already assembled. You would demand a higher price if someone asked to buy it from you, you take better care of it, and you feel genuine affection toward this object in a way that defies rational economic thinking. This phenomenon is known as the IKEA Effect, a cognitive bias wherein we place disproportionately high value on products we have partially created or assembled ourselves, regardless of the actual quality or objective worth of the final product. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through what psychologists call effort justification and the endowment effect working in tandem. When we invest our own labor into something, even trivial labor that requires minimal skill, our brains engage in a form of post hoc rationalization where we convince ourselves that this object must be valuable because we would not have spent time on something worthless. Additionally, the act of creation, no matter how minor our role in that creation, generates a psychological sense of ownership and identity attachment that transforms the object into an extension of ourselves. We have literally shaped it with our hands, made decisions about its placement, and overcome small obstacles to bring it into existence, and our minds weight these contributions far more heavily than the contributions of designers and manufacturers who created 99% of the actual value. Consider the student who has just spent 12 hours studying for an examination that ultimately proves far easier than expected, or the person who enrolls in an expensive gym membership, endures months of grueling workouts, and then convinces themselves that the program has fundamentally transformed their life despite minimal physical changes. These are manifestations of effort justification, a peculiar psychological mechanism wherein we unconsciously assign greater value and worth to outcomes that required substantial sacrifice, struggle, or time investment, regardless of whether those outcomes objectively merit such elevation. The phenomenon emerges from a deep cognitive dissonance that humans find unbearable to sit with. When we invest considerable energy into something, our minds face an uncomfortable contradiction. Either we must admit that we wasted our time and resources on something ultimately unrewarding, or we must convince ourselves that what we have done holds profound meaning and value. Most people choose the latter path, restructuring their perceptions and memories to align with their investments rather than facing the psychological discomfort of admitting futility. This mechanism operated throughout human history when survival genuinely depended upon completing difficult tasks, and our ancestors needed strong motivation to persist through hardship. The neural pathways that once served us well in wrestling wild boars or crossing treacherous terrain now fire automatically whenever we encounter any significant personal expenditure of effort. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that we rarely question why a meal tastes better when we cook it ourselves despite objectively identical ingredients, or why a handmade gift feels more precious than a store-bought alternative of superior quality. The justification loop continues perpetually because acknowledging effort justification requires us to doubt our own judgment and taste, a vulnerability most people find deeply threatening to their sense of self. Imagine you have invested $200 into a concert ticket 3 months in advance, and as the date approaches, you discover that the artist has changed dramatically in quality, the venue is poorly organized, and the weather forecast predicts torrential rain throughout the evening. Everything about the experience suggests that attending would bring you genuine displeasure, yet you find yourself getting ready, preparing an umbrella, and heading out anyway, simply because you have already spent the money and feel compelled to get your money's worth. This is the sunk cost fallacy in its most recognizable form, a cognitive bias where we continue investing time, money, or emotional energy into something primarily because we have already invested resources into it, rather than because the future benefits justify the continued investment. The sunk cost fallacy emerges from a fundamental misunderstanding of how decisions should be made in rational contexts. When we make choices, we should ideally consider only the present state of affairs and the future consequences of our actions, completely disregarding what we have already spent that cannot be recovered. Yet our minds persistently weigh the past investment as if it still matters to the current decision, as if our previous expenditure somehow obligates us to continue down a path that no longer serves us. This happens because we experience an emotional pain associated with loss and waste, a deep discomfort with the idea that money or time we invested has vanished without proportional return. We tell ourselves stories about justifying the past rather than optimizing the future. The sunk cost fallacy persists despite its logical irrationality because we have constructed entire cultural narratives around the importance of finishing what we start, of not wasting resources, of demonstrating commitment through perseverance. We have normalized the experience of throwing good money after bad, and we see it everywhere, in relationships that no longer fulfill us, in career paths we resent, in hobbies we no longer enjoy, in subscriptions we forget to cancel. Imagine you receive a coffee mug as a gift, nothing particularly special about it, perhaps with a simple design or your university logo printed across its surface, and you place it on your desk at home where it sits among your other possessions. Now imagine that a researcher approaches you and asks what price you would be willing to sell that mug for, and you find yourself naming a figure that is substantially higher than what you would have paid for an identical mug in a store just moments before you owned it. This peculiar divergence between what we will pay to acquire something and what we demand to let it go is the endowment effect, a cognitive bias so pervasive and powerful that it shapes nearly every economic transaction and personal possession in our lives. The mechanism underlying this effect appears to root itself in a fundamental process of ownership psychology, wherein the mere act of possessing an object creates a psychological attachment that transcends its objective market value, a phenomenon that researchers have traced to our brain's reward systems and our deep-seated need to maintain a sense of control and identity through our belongings. When we own something, our brains appear to integrate that object into our sense of self, treating it not merely as an external commodity, but as an extension of our own identity. And this integration triggers an emotional response that makes the prospect of parting with the object feel like a loss rather than a neutral transaction, activating our loss aversion systems, which are known to feel losses approximately twice as intensely as equivalent gains. Yet despite our intellectual awareness that this bias exists, that we can read about it in psychology textbooks and understand its logical inconsistency, we continue to experience it with remarkable consistency across cultures, age groups, and educational backgrounds, suggesting that the endowment effect represents something far deeper than a simple mistake in reasoning, rather pointing toward a fundamental aspect of how human consciousness constructs meaning and value through the act of possession itself. Imagine you are offered a choice between two scenarios. In the first, you are guaranteed to receive $100, and in the second, you have a 50% chance of receiving $200 and a 50% chance of receiving nothing at all. From a purely mathematical standpoint, both options have an expected value of $100, yet most people will choose the guaranteed amount rather than risk the uncertain outcome. Now imagine a different scenario where you are given $100 and then presented with a choice. You can either keep $50 for certain, or you can gamble and have a 50% chance of keeping all $100 and a 50% chance of losing everything. Logically, both scenarios should produce identical decision-making patterns, yet in this second case, people are far more likely to take the risk. This reversal of preference reveals something fundamental about human psychology that shapes nearly every significant decision we make in our lives. We feel the pain of losing something far more intensely than we feel the pleasure of gaining an equivalent amount. This phenomenon is called loss aversion, and it operates as one of the most powerful forces driving human behavior across economic choices, relationships, careers, and personal safety decisions. The mechanism underlying loss aversion appears to be rooted in our evolutionary past, where survival often depended on not losing what we already possessed rather than on acquiring new things. And this ancient weighting system remains embedded in our emotional and cognitive architecture today. We experience losses as roughly twice as psychologically damaging as equivalent gains are pleasurable, which means that the prospect of losing $50 generates far more distress than the prospect of gaining $50 generates satisfaction. This asymmetry persists even when we understand it intellectually, even when we know that rationally we should make different choices, and even when we can plainly see the mathematics that proves our emotional response is disproportionate to the actual risk involved. Imagine you are standing in a coffee shop faced with two options, a small coffee for $3 or a large coffee for $5. You find yourself genuinely uncertain which to choose, genuinely torn between the value proposition of each option. But then the barista mentions a third option, a medium coffee for $4.50, which is nearly the price of the large but offers you less product. Suddenly, without any rational explanation, the large coffee becomes the obvious choice. You were in different moments before, yet now you feel drawn toward the premium option with a clarity that seems almost inevitable. This is the decoy effect, one of the most pervasive and peculiar phenomena in human decision-making, where the introduction of an inferior third option fundamentally reshapes how you perceive the original two choices. The mechanism operates through a surprisingly elegant cognitive shortcut. When we encounter three options rather than two, our brains automatically engage in comparative analysis. The decoy, by its nature, is clearly worse than at least one of the original options, which means it serves as an anchor point for evaluation. Rather than assessing each choice independently against our own internal preferences and budgets, we suddenly begin measuring them against each other, looking for relative advantage. The medium coffee is worse than the large in every meaningful way, so the large suddenly appears to offer superior value by comparison. Our decision-making systems, it seems, are not primarily designed to evaluate options in absolute terms, but rather to find the best relative position within a given set. This mechanism persists even when we understand it intellectually, even when we have been explicitly taught about the decoy effect and its logical invalidity. We know with perfect rational certainty that the introduction of an irrelevant third option should not influence our preference between two previously evaluated choices, and yet it does persistently and reliably across cultures and demographic groups. Imagine walking into a furniture store where a leather sofa sits with a price tag of $800 crossed out, replaced by a new price of $499, and suddenly the purchase feels like an extraordinary bargain, like you would be foolish not to capitalize on such remarkable savings, even though you had no intention of buying furniture when you entered the store that morning. This is anchoring bias, one of the most pervasive and invisible forces shaping how we evaluate every decision we make. From the moment we encounter the first number or piece of information until we commit to a choice that will affect our lives and our wallets in ways we rarely fully comprehend. The psychological mechanism operates through a deceptively simple process in which our minds treat the first piece of information we receive, whether it is a price, a statistic, a claim, or even a random number mentioned in conversation, as a reference point from which all subsequent judgments are made, and we unconsciously adjust our estimates and evaluations around this initial anchor, never traveling far enough away from it to reach what might be called the objective truth. When you see that crossed-out price of $800, your brain instantly registers it as a meaningful reference point, establishing an invisible boundary within which all reasonable prices must fall. And when the discounted price of $499 appears, it feels dramatically lower than it actually is in any absolute sense, because your mind is comparing it not to the true value of the sofa, but to the anchor that was presented first. This bias persists with remarkable stubbornness, even when we are consciously aware that the anchor is arbitrary or manipulative, even when we remind ourselves that the original price might have been inflated specifically to create this psychological effect, even when we know logically that a number should have no influence on our perception of value, and yet the anchor holds sway over our judgment with an almost gravitational force that we cannot fully escape through willpower or self-awareness alone. Imagine a scenario where a charity organization calls you and asks if you would be willing to donate $5,000 to build a community center, a request so large and unreasonable that you immediately refuse without hesitation. perhaps even feeling slightly offended by the audacity of such an ask. Then moments later, the same caller pivots and asks if you might be willing to donate just $50 instead, a sum that suddenly feels manageable and reasonable in comparison to what was just requested. You find yourself agreeing to this smaller donation, feeling almost relieved that the ask has become so modest, when in truth you might never have donated anything at all if the caller had simply asked for $50 from the very beginning. This is the door-in-the-face technique, a persuasion method that operates by first making an unreasonably large request that you reject outright, thereby metaphorically closing the door in the asker's face, only to follow that rejection with a much smaller and more reasonable request that you are now significantly more likely to accept. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves several interconnected processes, most notably the reciprocity norm, which suggests that when someone makes a concession toward you by lowering their initial request, you feel a social obligation to reciprocate that concession by agreeing to their revised proposal. Additionally, there exists a contrast effect whereby the second request seems dramatically more reasonable and palatable when positioned directly against the first impossibly large request, creating a psychological anchor that makes the smaller ask feel almost trivial. Furthermore, rejection itself can activate feelings of guilt or social discomfort within the person who has refused, and agreeing to the second request offers a way to alleviate that discomfort and restore a sense of balance in the social interaction. Imagine a charity organization calling you on a Tuesday evening asking if you would be willing to donate just $1 to their cause, a sum so small that refusing feels almost petty, so you agree, and then 2 weeks later they call again asking for a much larger donation, perhaps $50 this time, and you find yourself far more inclined to say yes than you would have been had they asked for that amount initially. Or consider a salesman who begins by asking you merely to listen to a brief product demonstration, nothing binding, just information, and once you have invited him into your home and engaged with his presentation, you discover yourself significantly more likely to make a purchase than if he had led with the actual sales pitch. This phenomenon is known as the foot in the door technique, and it represents one of the most pervasive patterns in human compliance and persuasion. The mechanism operates through a principle of consistency and self-perception that runs deeper than rational calculation. When we agree to a small initial request, we create a baseline of cooperation and engagement, but more importantly, we begin to see ourselves as the kind of person who cooperates with this individual or organization, and this self-image becomes surprisingly powerful in determining our future behavior. Once we have made a small commitment, we experience a subtle pressure to remain consistent with that commitment, to align our subsequent actions with the identity we have begun to establish. The initial agreement, seemingly insignificant, fundamentally alters the psychological landscape of the interaction, making larger requests feel like natural extensions rather than new propositions. Yet what remains fascinating is how readily we fall into this pattern despite understanding its mechanism intellectually. Imagine receiving an unexpected gift from someone you barely know, or having a colleague do you a small favor without being asked, and immediately feeling a subtle weight settle into your chest, a sense of obligation that seems disproportionate to what was actually offered. This is the reciprocity trap in its most essential form, a psychological mechanism so deeply woven into human social fabric that we rarely recognize it as operating at all. The trap begins innocuously enough when someone provides us with something of value, whether material or intangible, and our minds automatically trigger an internal accounting system that insists we owe them something in return. This isn't a conscious decision we make. Rather, it's a deeply ingrained social instinct that evolved to facilitate cooperation and trust within communities where reciprocal exchanges formed the foundation of survival. However, the reciprocity trap becomes problematic when this natural impulse is exploited or when it creates obligations that far exceed the original gesture in scope or burden. A salesperson who gives you a small gift might find you substantially more likely to purchase their expensive product, not because the gift has genuine value, but because your brain has registered a debt that must be repaid. A friend who performs one significant favor can subtly leverage that action to extract future compliance, and you find yourself agreeing to requests you would otherwise refuse, all because the original gesture created an invisible ledger in your mind. What makes this trap particularly insidious is that it persists even when we're aware of its mechanisms. because the impulse to reciprocate operates at an emotional and social level that exists beneath conscious reasoning. We've normalized this exchange as the fundamental currency of human relationships, rarely questioning why we should feel obligated to repay someone simply because they gave us something first, or why the value of our return gesture must somehow balance what we received. Imagine walking into a room where everyone is laughing, and within moments you find yourself smiling or laughing along, even though you have no idea what the joke was, and moments before you felt completely neutral or even slightly sad. Or consider sitting in a meeting where your colleague appears visibly anxious about a presentation, their leg bouncing, their voice trembling slightly, and you notice your own heart rate beginning to quicken in sympathy, your palms growing slightly damp despite the fact that you are not the one presenting. These are experiences of emotional contagion, a phenomenon in which the emotional state of one person automatically transfers to another, creating a shared emotional experience without any conscious decision or logical deliberation on your part. The mechanism underlying this paradoxical transfer operates through multiple interconnected pathways in the human brain and body. When we observe another person experiencing an emotion, our mirror neuron systems activate, causing our brains to simulate that same emotional state internally, and simultaneously, our bodies begin to mirror their physiological responses through unconscious mimicry of facial expressions, posture, and vocal tone, which in turn signals our own nervous systems to generate the corresponding emotional chemicals and physical sensations. This process happens so rapidly and automatically that we often feel the emotion before we even become consciously aware that we are experiencing it. And the paradox emerges in the fact that we are being emotionally hijacked by someone else's internal state despite having complete logical understanding that their emotions are separate from ours and may stem from entirely different circumstances and concerns that have nothing to do with us whatsoever. Imagine yourself standing in a group of people tasked with pulling a rope, or perhaps sitting in a meeting where your team is brainstorming solutions to a complex problem, or volunteering alongside others to clean up a community space. In each of these scenarios, something peculiar happens to your effort and motivation, something that feels almost involuntary, a subtle shift in how much energy you're willing to expend when others are present and contributing to the same goal. This phenomenon is social loafing, and it occurs when individuals exert less effort in a group setting than they would if working alone on an identical task. The reduction in personal effort happens not because the goal becomes less important, but rather because the presence of others creates a psychological buffer between your actions and their consequences, a diffusion of responsibility that makes your individual contribution feel less necessary or observable. The mechanism beneath this behavior reveals something fundamental about human motivation and accountability. When you work alone, every outcome traces directly back to your effort, and every failure or success is unmistakably yours to own. However, when you're part of a collective, the causal chain becomes obscured and fragmented, and your contribution blends into the larger output in ways that become difficult to isolate or measure. Your mind registers this obscurity, this anonymity within the group, and recalibrates your investment accordingly, reasoning that your reduced effort will likely go unnoticed and that others will compensate for any slack you leave behind. Additionally, there exists an implicit calculation regarding fairness and equity. If you sense that other group members might themselves be loafing, a reciprocal reduction in your own effort feels justified, creating a downward spiral of motivation that becomes self-reinforcing and increasingly difficult to reverse once established. Imagine a crowded street in the middle of a busy city where someone collapses on the sidewalk in front of dozens of pedestrians. Each person passing by glances at the figure, feels a momentary pang of concern, but continues walking, assuming that surely someone else will help, that the responsibility belongs to another person in the crowd rather than to them. This phenomenon, known as the diffusion of responsibility, describes how our sense of personal accountability diminishes as the number of people present in a situation increases, creating a peculiar psychological paradox where the presence of more potential helpers actually results in less help being offered. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through several interconnected pathways within our cognitive and emotional systems. When we find ourselves among others in a moment of crisis or need, our individual sense of duty becomes fragmented and distributed across the group, each person's responsibility proportionally reduced by the presence of every other person nearby. We experience what researchers call pluralistic ignorance, where we look to others for cues about how to respond, and when everyone appears calm and uninvolved, we interpret that collective indifference as a signal that intervention is unnecessary or inappropriate. Additionally, our minds engage in a form of responsibility calculation where we unconsciously divide accountability among all present parties, reasoning that if something needs to be done, it will be done by someone, therefore it does not need to be done by us. This diffusion occurs even when the situation seems objectively urgent and the need for help is unambiguous, yet we find ourselves remaining passive because we perceive the responsibility as shared rather than individual. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is how it persists despite our conscious awareness of the problem and our explicit knowledge that more bystanders should logically result in more help, not less. Imagine a boardroom where executives gather to decide the fate of a major corporate merger, or a jury deliberating in a closed room, or even a friend group deciding where to spend the evening, and notice how quickly individual opinions collapse into a single unified voice, often without anyone realizing it has happened. This is groupthink, a psychological phenomenon where the desire for harmony and consensus in a group becomes so powerful that it overrides realistic appraisal of alternative courses of action and suppresses critical evaluation of the group's chosen direction. What begins as a reasonable discussion gradually transforms into an echo chamber where dissenting voices grow quieter, alternative perspectives seem less worthy of consideration, and the collective decision feels inevitable and correct. Even when examined individually, many members harbor private doubts. The mechanism behind this paradox operates through several interlocking psychological pressures. First, there is genuine social cohesion and belonging, which makes people reluctant to rock the boat or be perceived as the obstinate outsider who questions the group's wisdom. Second, there is the illusion of unanimity, where silence is interpreted as agreement, and those with reservations assume they are alone in their concerns. Third, there is the role of authority figures within the group, whose early opinions shape the direction of discussion and make contradicting them feel risky. And finally, there is what researchers call mind guards, trusted members who actively suppress contradictory information or shield the group from external criticism. What makes groupthink so insidious is that it feels like the opposite of conformity. It feels like collaboration, like unity, like the group functioning exactly as groups should function. We have normalized this phenomenon so thoroughly that we celebrate team players and call them decisive, never noticing that what looked like leadership was actually the silencing of doubt, and what appeared to be efficiency was actually the elimination of necessary friction that might have prevented catastrophic decisions. Consider a scenario where a group of friends gathers to decide whether to pursue a risky business venture that could either yield substantial profits or result in significant financial loss. And notice how the collective recommendation tends to be more daring than what any individual member would have suggested in isolation. This phenomenon, known as risky shift, describes the curious tendency of groups to make more extreme decisions than their individual members would make alone, often gravitating toward greater risk rather than toward caution. When people congregate and deliberate together, something shifts in the psychological landscape, and the boundaries of acceptable risk seem to expand in ways that contradict our intuitive understanding of group dynamics. We might expect groups to be more conservative, more cautious, more risk-averse due to the collective responsibility and shared consequences, yet research consistently demonstrates the opposite pattern across diverse contexts. The mechanism underlying risky shift appears to be rooted in the diffusion of responsibility that emerges when individual accountability dissolves into collective ownership of outcomes. When one person makes a risky decision and it fails, that individual bears the full weight of the failure. But when a group makes the same risky decision and it fails, the responsibility fragments among all participants, rendering the personal cost of failure somehow more bearable. Additionally, there exists a social comparison process whereby individuals within groups seek to present themselves as adequately bold and unconventional, creating an implicit competition of confidence that progressively escalates risk tolerance as each member attempts to demonstrate they are not overly cautious relative to their peers. The phenomenon reveals something profound about how our sense of judgment and risk becomes untethered from individual reasoning when we are embedded in collective deliberation, and how the presence of others fundamentally recalibrates our perception of what constitutes reasonable behavior. Imagine sitting in a lecture hall where the professor has just explained a complex concept, and the moment they ask if anyone has questions, the entire room falls silent, yet you have no idea what they just said, and you suspect many others don't either. And so you all sit there nodding along as if understanding, each person assuming that everyone else grasped the material perfectly while you alone are struggling. When in reality, most of the room shares your confusion, but nobody speaks up because nobody else is speaking up, creating this strange collective fiction where a room full of confused people all believe they're the only one who doesn't understand. This phenomenon is called pluralistic ignorance, and it represents one of the most fascinating yet troubling paradoxes of human social behavior, where people collectively misinterpret a situation or fail to act based on incorrect assumptions about what others think or understand, assumptions that arise simply because nobody breaks the silence first. The mechanism is deceptively straightforward. When faced with ambiguity, humans look to others for cues about how to respond, and when others appear calm or knowledgeable, we interpret this as evidence that everything is fine or that the situation has been handled. But what we fail to realize is that those other people are doing the exact same thing, looking at us and interpreting our silence as confidence, creating a recursive loop where inaction and uncertainty reinforce themselves through mutual observation. This persists in classrooms, in meetings, in social gatherings, and even in emergencies, where bystanders watch a person in distress and assume someone else will help because no one else is reacting, not realizing that everyone around them is thinking the very same thought. And so the person requiring aid receives none despite being surrounded by dozens of potential helpers, each waiting for someone else to take responsibility. Imagine sitting in a meeting where you express a particular viewpoint about how a project should be handled, and afterward, you feel relatively confident that most people in the room probably agree with you, even though no one explicitly said so. Later, you discover that several colleagues actually held quite different opinions but remained silent. This quiet certainty that our beliefs and behaviors are more widely shared than they actually are represents one of the most pervasive yet invisible distortions in human judgment, a phenomenon known as the false consensus effect. We tend to assume that our own beliefs, values, and ways of behaving are more common and more normal than they genuinely are within the broader population, while simultaneously underestimating how many people disagree with us or live according to different principles. The mechanism behind this effect operates through several interconnected psychological pathways. First, we are naturally exposed to a biased sample of the world around us, surrounded primarily by people who share our backgrounds, interests, education levels, and general worldviews, which creates an echo chamber that makes our perspectives feel universal. Second, we engage in a form of motivated reasoning, where believing that others share our views feels psychologically comfortable and validates our sense of normalcy and belonging. Third, we tend to notice and remember instances that confirm our beliefs about consensus, while overlooking or forgetting instances that contradict it, a selective attention bias that reinforces our distorted perception. We also attribute disagreement to external factors like ignorance or irrationality, rather than recognizing it as legitimate alternative thinking. Despite understanding intellectually that humans are diverse and hold varied perspectives, we continue to walk through the world assuming that our particular way of seeing things is far more mainstream than it actually is, leading us to be surprised and even judgmental when we encounter genuine disagreement. Consider a moment when you find yourself frustrated with a colleague who seems unable to understand your perspective, yet you believe you comprehend their motivations perfectly well, convinced that you see through their defensiveness or denial in ways they cannot see their own behavior. This asymmetry in perception, where we simultaneously believe we understand others better than they understand themselves, while also believing that others fundamentally misunderstand us, represents one of the most pervasive yet invisible paradoxes of human social life. When your friend cancels plans last minute, you quickly assume external circumstances forced their hand, yet when you cancel, you sense that they interpret your cancellation as a character flaw, as evidence of your unreliability or lack of care. The psychological mechanism underlying this illusion operates through what researchers call the actor-observer bias combined with a special pleading fallacy we extend exclusively to ourselves, creating a distorted lens through which we view our own actions as situationally determined while viewing others' identical actions as personality-driven. We have access to our own internal narrative, our genuine intentions, our competing pressures, and our moments of weakness, but we observe others only through their behavior and the gaps they leave, filling those gaps with assumptions that tend toward unflattering conclusions. What persists despite its logical incoherence is our unwavering confidence in this asymmetric insight, our genuine belief that we see people more clearly than they see themselves, that our judgments about their nature penetrate deeper than their own self-awareness, even as we simultaneously insist that we are tragically misunderstood by those very same people. We have constructed an entire social world around this impossible duality, where miscommunication becomes inevitable and conflict becomes almost a foregone conclusion. Consider a moment when you and a friend have fundamentally disagreed about something you both witnessed, perhaps a conversation that happened between you and another person, or a decision made by someone in power, or even the interpretation of a simple event that unfolded in front of you both. You remember it one way with perfect clarity, feeling absolutely certain that your version is objective truth, while your friend insists with equal conviction that they saw something entirely different. In that moment, neither of you is lying, neither of you is trying to deceive the other, and yet you occupy completely different realities. This is naive realism, the profound psychological paradox wherein each of us genuinely believes we see the world as it actually is, objectively and accurately, while simultaneously believing that anyone who disagrees with us is either misinformed, biased, irrational, or intentionally distorting the truth. The mechanism underlying this paradox is deceptively simple yet extraordinarily powerful. Our brains do not passively receive the world like a camera recording footage. Instead, they actively construct our experience of reality through filtering, interpreting, and organizing incoming information according to our existing beliefs, desires, expectations, and accumulated experiences. This construction process happens entirely beneath conscious awareness, invisible to us, so that the final product arriving in our consciousness feels like direct perception rather than inference. We naturally assume that what we perceive is what actually exists, because we have no access to the invisible work our minds performed to create that perception. When someone else perceives something differently, our brain treats this not as evidence that perception is constructed, but rather as evidence that the other person is flawed in some way, whether through ignorance, bias, or malice. This bias persists with remarkable resilience because the very mechanism that causes it makes it immune to correction. Imagine sitting in a room with a friend who holds political beliefs you find completely irrational, yet when you examine your own convictions with the same critical lens, you feel certain that yours are based on logic and evidence and careful consideration of the facts. This friend might accuse you of being biased, which feels offensive because you genuinely believe you are among the least biased people you know, perhaps even priding yourself on your objectivity and fair-mindedness. Meanwhile, your friend feels exactly the same way about themselves, equally convinced of their own rationality and equally dismissive of any suggestion that their judgment might be clouded by prejudice or preference. This is the bias blind spot, a psychological phenomenon in which we recognize bias in others with remarkable ease while remaining almost completely blind to the exact same biases operating within our own minds and decisions. The mechanism operates through a fundamental asymmetry in how we process information about ourselves versus information about others. When we observe someone else making a decision, we tend to attribute it to their personal characteristics, their beliefs, their biases, their inherent nature. But when we make that same decision ourselves, we experience only the information we consciously considered, the reasoning we ran through, the logical steps we took, and we naturally assume our conclusion reflects objective reality rather than our filtered perspective. We have access to our own thought processes from the inside, which creates an illusion of transparency that makes us feel uniquely positioned to judge ourselves fairly. Yet this same internal access blinds us to the unconscious filters, the automatic preferences, the ingrained assumptions that shaped our thinking before conscious deliberation even began. The paradox persists because the very mechanism that creates the blind spot also prevents us from easily detecting it, since recognizing our own biases would require us to step outside our own perspective, an act that seems straightforward in theory but proves remarkably difficult in practice. Imagine sitting in a waiting room where a commercial plays on the television, one designed to convince people to buy a new product through exaggerated claims and emotional manipulation. And you notice that while you find the advertisement somewhat transparent and unconvincing, you genuinely believe that the other people in the room, particularly those who seem less educated or less critical than yourself, will fall for it completely and alter their purchasing decisions based on what they see. This is the third-person effect, a peculiar cognitive bias where we consistently believe that media messages, advertising campaigns, propaganda, and persuasive communications have a greater influence on other people than they do on ourselves, even when we are exposed to the exact same information in the exact same context. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through several psychological layers that reinforce our sense of intellectual superiority and cognitive immunity to influence. When we encounter a persuasive message, our minds simultaneously process both the message itself and our own resistance to it, creating an asymmetrical perception where we can identify our own reasons for skepticism and rational dismissal, while we attribute other people's susceptibility to character flaws, lower intelligence, or simple gullibility, rather than considering that they might be engaging in the same critical thinking process we believe we are engaging in ourselves. We tend to view ourselves as more discerning, more aware of manipulation tactics, and more capable of independent thought than our peers, which creates a protective psychological bubble where we maintain confidence in our own judgment while remaining suspicious of everyone else's judgment, even though statistically speaking, we are all exposed to the same cognitive limitations and biases. Imagine a colleague arrives late to an important meeting, and without hesitation, you assume they are irresponsible, unpunctual, or simply do not care enough about the work. You form an immediate judgment about their character based on this single action, anchoring it to some perceived personality flaw or lack of dedication. Yet consider what might actually be true. Their child was sick that morning, their car broke down on the highway, or they were helping someone in genuine distress. The difference between these scenarios reveals a profound gap in how we interpret human behavior, a gap so consistent and so universal that psychologists named it the fundamental attribution error. This is our tendency to overestimate the role of personal characteristics and underestimate the power of situational factors when explaining why other people behave the way they do. When we ourselves are late, we immediately recognize the situation. Traffic was terrible, unexpected complications arose, circumstances beyond our control intervened. But when others exhibit the same behavior, we skip past the situational analysis entirely and leap directly to character judgment. The mechanism operates because we have incomplete information about other people's lives. We see their actions, but remain largely blind to the context surrounding those actions. We witness the behavior itself, which is vivid and salient and immediate, while the situation remains abstract and invisible. Our minds use a kind of cognitive shortcut, filling in the blanks with assumptions about personality and disposition rather than engaging in the more effortful work of considering external pressures and constraints. What makes this error so persistent despite being logically flawed is that we never receive clear feedback correcting it. We rarely learn what circumstances actually motivated someone else's behavior, so our original character judgments calcify into beliefs. We continue operating under false assumptions about who people are, all while remaining convinced of our accuracy and insight. Imagine you're sitting in traffic, and another driver cuts you off without warning, forcing you to brake suddenly and sending your heart racing with adrenaline and anger. In that moment, you immediately think that this driver is reckless, impatient, thoughtless, and fundamentally a bad person who does not respect the safety of others on the road. You might mutter to yourself about how careless they are, how they clearly do not care about anyone else, and how this behavior reflects their true character and values. However, flip the scenario around, and now imagine that you yourself have just cut someone off while driving. In this case, your internal narrative shifts dramatically. You think about how you were distracted by an important phone call, how the sun was in your eyes, how that lane changed rather unexpectedly, or how you simply did not see the other vehicle in your blind spot. You attribute your behavior to circumstance, to temporary distraction, to factors outside your control, not to any fundamental flaw in your character or judgment. This profound asymmetry in how we explain the behavior of others versus how we explain our own behavior is the actor-observer bias, one of the most pervasive and consequential distortions in human perception. The mechanism underlying this bias stems from the difference in information available and the difference in attention between the actor and the observer. When you are the actor, you have extensive knowledge of all the contextual factors surrounding your behavior, all the pressures you are under, all the competing demands on your attention, and all the extenuating circumstances that influenced your choice. Your attention is naturally directed outward toward the environment and the obstacles within it. When you are the observer, you have access to none of this rich contextual information. You see only the behavior itself, the action isolated from its context, and your attention naturally focuses on the person performing the action rather than on the invisible circumstances surrounding them. Consider the moment when a colleague arrives late to an important meeting, and immediately you construct a narrative about their character. They are irresponsible, disorganized, or perhaps they do not take their work seriously enough. You weave together conclusions about their personality and their values based on this single behavioral incident. Yet when you yourself arrive late to a meeting, the explanation feels entirely different in your own mind. You acknowledge the traffic jam you encountered, the unexpected phone call that detained you, the series of circumstances beyond your control that conspired against your punctuality. The fundamental mechanism at work here is the ultimate attribution error, a systematic bias in how we explain the behavior of others compared to how we explain our own identical behaviors. When someone else acts in a particular way, we tend to attribute that action primarily to their internal characteristics, their personality traits, their motivations, and their inherent dispositions. Conversely, when we ourselves engage in the exact same behavior, we readily point to external circumstances, situational pressures, contextual factors, and environmental constraints that made our action inevitable or reasonable under the circumstances. This asymmetry persists because we have profoundly different access to information about ourselves and others. We possess intimate knowledge of our own internal states, our genuine intentions, and the full context of pressures acting upon us in any given moment. We observe others only from the outside, seeing their actions without access to their private thoughts, their struggles, or the specific circumstances they navigate. Over time, this cognitive pattern becomes so normalized that we scarcely notice it operating within our judgments. We construct entire reputations and relationship dynamics built upon these systematically biased attributions, never fully recognizing that we are comparing our own situation awareness to their action visibility, a fundamentally unequal comparison that distorts every human interaction we undertake. Consider the moment when a project at work succeeds, and you find yourself immediately thinking about all the effort you personally invested, all the clever decisions you made, the long hours you stayed late refining the details, and how your specific contributions were truly the deciding factor in the outcome. Now consider what happens when that same project fails, and notice how your mind quickly shifts responsibility outward, focusing instead on unclear instructions from management, uncooperative team members, inadequate resources, or simply bad luck that was beyond anyone's control. This asymmetry in how we interpret our own successes and failures is the self-serving bias, one of the most pervasive patterns in human psychology, and it operates so subtly that we rarely notice it happening within our own minds. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in our deep need to maintain a positive self-image and protect our self-esteem in the face of a world that regularly challenges our competence and worth. When something good happens, our brain automatically attributes it to internal factors, to our abilities and our character and our choices, because this narrative feels good and reinforces our sense of control and capability. When something bad happens, our mind performs an elegant psychological escape, attributing the failure to external circumstances, to factors beyond our influence, to bad timing or other people's mistakes, because this protects us from the painful conclusion that we ourselves are flawed or incompetent. What makes this bias so persistent despite its obvious lack of logical foundation is precisely how emotionally soothing it is to maintain. We have normalized this distorted view of ourselves so thoroughly that it feels like objective truth, and we experience any challenge to it as a personal attack rather than as feedback. We watch others engage in this same bias constantly, attributing their successes to luck and their failures to personal shortcomings, yet we remain largely blind to the pattern in ourselves, certain that our own assessments are accurate and fair. Imagine a person who has experienced tremendous hardship, a serious illness, financial ruin, or a tragic accident, and observe how often the people around them respond with subtle blame rather than pure compassion. Someone might say things like, "Well, they must have done something to deserve it," or "there must have been warning signs they ignored," or even "God works in mysterious ways," as if the suffering itself was somehow earned or justified. This tendency to believe that the world operates on a system of cosmic fairness, where good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, is known as the just world hypothesis, and it is one of the most pervasive and psychologically protective beliefs humans hold. The mechanism beneath this phenomenon is rooted in our deep psychological need to feel safe and in control of our circumstances. If we believe the world is fundamentally just, then we can convince ourselves that bad things only happen to people who deserve them, which by extension means that if we behave well and make good choices, we are insulated from tragedy. This belief allows us to walk through an inherently unpredictable and often cruel world without being paralyzed by the constant awareness of random suffering. The just world hypothesis becomes reinforced through selective memory and confirmation bias, where we notice and remember the times when justice prevails while forgetting the countless examples where it does not. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence that innocent people suffer and guilty people flourish, we somehow maintain this comforting fiction, perhaps because the alternative, accepting that fate is arbitrary and uncontrollable, would undermine our sense of agency and security too fundamentally to bear. Imagine a person who has held a particular conviction for many years, perhaps about a political ideology, a religious doctrine, or even the character of someone they know intimately, and one day they encounter substantial evidence that directly contradicts this long-held belief. Instead of immediately reconsidering their position in light of this new information, they find themselves unconsciously dismissing the evidence, reinterpreting it to fit their existing worldview, or even doubling down on their original conviction with greater intensity and certainty than before. This phenomenon is belief perseverance, and it represents one of the most stubborn and pervasive patterns in human psychology. When we first form a belief, our minds don't simply store it as a neutral fact waiting to be updated like data in a filing cabinet. Instead, we construct an elaborate architecture around that belief, weaving it into our identity, our relationships, our understanding of how the world works, and our sense of what it means to be the person we are. This mental infrastructure becomes so integrated into our sense of self that challenging the belief feels equivalent to challenging our own worth and existence. When contradictory evidence arrives, our brains engage in what cognitive psychologists call defensive processing, where we scrutinize the new information far more critically than we ever scrutinized the original belief, looking for methodological flaws, biased sources, or hidden agendas that might explain away the contradiction. The deeper and more central a belief is to our identity, the more vigorous this defensive response becomes, and paradoxically, the stronger the contradictory evidence, the more entrenched the original belief may become as we mobilize increasingly creative justifications and rationalizations. Imagine a person who believes that their political party is fundamentally more honest than the opposing party, and when they encounter news about a scandal involving their own party, they instinctively scrutinize it heavily, looking for alternative explanations or hidden context that might exonerate their preferred group. While when identical information surfaces about the opposing party, they accept it immediately without requiring the same level of evidence or investigation. And this pattern persists not because the person is consciously dishonest or deliberately avoiding truth, but because their mind has developed an intricate filtering system that prioritizes information which aligns with their existing worldview while treating contradictory information with suspicion and resistance. This phenomenon, known as confirmation bias, represents one of the most pervasive and consequential patterns in human cognition, operating beneath conscious awareness in nearly every interaction, decision, and belief we hold. The mechanism underlying this tendency emerges from the brain's fundamental need to conserve cognitive resources and maintain psychological stability. Since our minds are constantly bombarded with far more sensory information and potential knowledge than we could possibly process. So the brain develops shortcuts that allow it to accept information congruent with established beliefs quickly while demanding higher standards of proof for contradictory information, essentially creating mental pathways of least resistance. We seek out sources that confirm what we already believe, we interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support our existing perspectives, we remember information that aligned with our views more vividly than information that challenged them, and we even unconsciously position ourselves in social environments where our existing beliefs are reinforced rather than challenged. Imagine a person reading a scientific study about a topic they care deeply about. If the findings support their existing beliefs, they quickly accept the methodology as sound, the sample size as adequate, and the conclusions as compelling. Yet if that same study contradicts their worldview, suddenly they become a rigorous critic, questioning every aspect of the research design, pointing out potential biases, and dismissing the results as unreliable. The study itself remains unchanged, but their evaluation of its credibility shifts entirely based on whether it confirms or challenges what they already believe. This is motivated reasoning, the psychological mechanism by which our desires, emotions, and pre-existing convictions unconsciously shape how we think about evidence and arguments. Rather than evaluating information objectively, we tend to process it through a filter of motivation. We want certain conclusions to be true, and our minds oblige by finding reasons to believe them while dismissing contrary evidence as flawed or irrelevant. The mechanisms underlying this phenomenon are remarkably subtle and efficient. Our brains engage in selective attention, causing us to notice information that aligns with our preferences while overlooking contradictory data. We also engage in biased evaluation, where we apply different standards of scrutiny depending on whether information threatens or supports our identity and beliefs. Confirmation bias acts as an amplifier, making us seek out sources that already agree with us and interpret ambiguous information as supporting our position. What makes motivated reasoning particularly persistent despite its logical inconsistency is that it operates largely outside conscious awareness. We genuinely believe we are being objective, while our minds quietly adjust our reasoning to reach preferred conclusions. We have normalized this tendency so completely that we rarely recognize it in ourselves, though we easily spot it in others. Consider a statement you encounter repeatedly across social media, in conversations with friends, or in news cycles. A claim about health, politics, history, or human nature that circulates widely without any original source or verified evidence, yet somehow feels increasingly familiar and credible with each exposure. Perhaps it's a statistic about productivity, a claim about what percentage of communication is nonverbal, or a generalization about generational behavior that has been repeated so many times that you begin to accept it as established fact rather than questionable assertion. This phenomenon represents the illusory truth effect, where repeated exposure to a statement increases our belief in its accuracy regardless of whether that statement has been verified or is actually true. When we encounter information multiple times, our brains develop a fluency with that information, a sense of ease in processing it, and our minds mistakenly interpret this processing fluency as evidence of truthfulness. We confuse familiarity with validity, mistaking the comfort of recognition for the confirmation of accuracy, a cognitive shortcut that evolved to help us navigate a simpler informational landscape, but now works against us in an age of infinite repetition and algorithmic amplification. The effect persists despite our awareness of it, despite our logical understanding that truth and repetition should be independent variables, because the mechanism operates largely beneath conscious awareness, working through the intuitive system of cognition rather than deliberate reasoning. We have normalized this effect so thoroughly that marketing industries, political campaigns, and social movements all harness it as a fundamental tool, knowing that to repeat something enough times is essentially to make it true in the minds of those who hear it, transforming speculation into conviction through sheer exposure alone. Imagine you receive a persuasive message from a source you find questionable or unreliable, and in that moment, you dismiss it entirely because you simply do not trust where it came from. You might hear a compelling argument about a health benefit, a political position, or a social trend, but because it arrives via tabloid publication or someone you consider uninformed, you reject the entire premise outright. Yet weeks or months later, you find yourself believing that very same claim, and you cannot quite remember where you originally encountered it or why you initially dismissed it. This is the sleeper effect, one of the most peculiar phenomena in how human memory and persuasion intersect, and it reveals something fundamental about the way our minds process information over time. The mechanism operates on a deceptively simple principle. When we first encounter a message, we naturally tag it with information about its source, and if that source carries low credibility in our minds, we actively discount the content. However, our memory for the source degrades far more rapidly than our memory for the message itself. Over time, the association between what was said and who said it begins to deteriorate, like a fading photograph where one element grows dim before the content remains accessible in our minds, but the credibility tag attached to it grows weaker and less prominent. As this happens, the message gradually loses the negative context that once protected our beliefs, and without that anchor of distrust, the idea becomes more persuasive simply because it now floats free from its discredited origins. What makes this particularly fascinating is that we do not notice this process occurring and we certainly do not intentionally choose to accept ideas we once rejected. Instead, the sleeper effect represents a kind of temporal blind spot in human psychology, where the logical filters we installed fade away before our actual convictions shift to match the now sourceless information. Imagine a restaurant that becomes increasingly popular simply because it is popular, a phenomenon that has nothing to do with the quality of its food or service, but rather with the visible presence of other diners occupying its tables and booths. When you arrive and see the place half full, you assume it must be good, and you decide to stay, which makes it appear even fuller to the next person who walks through the door, and they too assume it must be worth their time, creating a self-reinforcing spiral where availability itself becomes the primary signal of quality. This is the availability cascade, a psychological pattern in which our assessment of value, credibility, truth, or desirability becomes fundamentally distorted by how frequently we encounter something in our immediate environment. The mechanism operates through a deceptively simple cognitive shortcut. Our minds have evolved to treat frequency and visibility as reliable proxies for importance and reliability. If many people are doing something, saying something, or believing something, our brain interprets this prevalence as evidence that it must be legitimate, worthwhile, or true, because surely that many people would not converge on something without good reason. This logic feels sound in an ancestral context where information traveled slowly and consensus required genuine coordination. Yet in modern environments saturated with amplification mechanisms, algorithmic promotion, marketing saturation, and social media dynamics, this assumption collapses entirely. A belief can cascade through availability alone, becoming more visible simply because it is visible, attracting more believers not because of evidence, but because the previous believers made it impossible to ignore. We normalize this pattern despite recognizing intellectually that visibility proves nothing about truth or quality, and we continue deferring to prevalence as though it were a reliable metric, building our opinions and choices upon the architecture of what happens to be frequent rather than what actually deserves to be believed. Imagine you've just watched a news report about a plane crash that killed 200 people, and suddenly you become convinced that flying is extraordinarily dangerous, more dangerous perhaps than driving, when statistically the opposite is profoundly true. Or consider how after hearing about a friend's experience with food poisoning from a particular restaurant, you avoid that establishment entirely, yet you continue patronizing countless other venues where the probability of contamination might be identical or even greater. This is the availability heuristic at work, a cognitive shortcut where your brain estimates the likelihood or frequency of an event based not on actual statistical probability, but on how easily examples of that event come to mind. The mechanism is deceptively simple. Your mind treats vivid, memorable, or recently encountered information as though it represents the true proportion of reality, when in fact it merely reflects what happens to be psychologically accessible to you in that moment. When something is emotionally charged or dramatic, when it involves concrete personal experiences, or when it has been repeatedly exposed through media coverage, your brain gives it disproportionate weight in your calculations of risk and frequency. This happens because your mind evolved in an environment where the things you could remember easily were often genuinely important for survival, making this shortcut occasionally useful but profoundly unreliable in modern contexts where media coverage and emotional intensity no longer correlate with actual danger or prevalence. We persist in using this heuristic despite understanding its flaws because it requires genuine cognitive effort to override it, because we remain fundamentally drawn to the stories that stick with us rather than to abstract statistics, and because admitting the randomness of our experiences and the limitations of our personal knowledge feels psychologically uncomfortable in ways that accepting vivid examples does not. Consider a moment when you receive feedback on a project you have worked on for weeks, and in that feedback, there are 9 compliments and 1 criticism, yet the singular negative comment is the one that echoes through your mind for days afterward, replaying itself endlessly while the 9 affirmations fade into obscurity almost immediately. This is negativity bias at work, a fundamental asymmetry in how the human mind processes information, weighing negative experiences, words, and outcomes as though they carry roughly 3 times more psychological weight than their positive counterparts. The The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted deep within our evolutionary ancestry, where our ancestors lived in environments where missing a threat could result in death, while missing an opportunity might merely result in hunger, thus creating a survival calculus that made the detection and internalization of danger exponentially more important than the recognition of safety. This ancient wiring remains fully intact in the modern human brain, causing us to scan our environments and our interactions with a threat detection apparatus that is perpetually calibrated toward the negative, toward what could go wrong, toward what someone might have meant poorly, toward the one piece of criticism in an ocean of praise. We see this bias manifest in how we review restaurants, absorbing the single one-star review with the same intensity that we should be receiving the 25-star reviews, or how a single harsh comment on social media can ruin our entire experience of sharing something we are proud of, or how a relationship conflict can overshadow months of genuine affection and support. The paradox deepens when we recognize that this bias persists even though our modern world rarely requires such hypervigilance, even though most of us are not in genuine physical danger, even though the negative events we fear rarely materialize with the frequency our brains predict they will. Consider the experience of moving through time with memories that have wounded you deeply. You recall a significant conflict from months or years ago, a moment when someone betrayed your trust, or when you failed spectacularly in front of others, and you notice something peculiar happening within your psychological landscape. The emotional intensity surrounding that memory has diminished considerably, yet the factual details remain largely intact or even become sharper with repetition. The sting has faded while the story remains. This is fading effect bias, a curious phenomenon where negative emotions attached to our memories naturally decay and weaken over time, even as the memories themselves persist with surprising clarity. While you can recite exactly what happened during that embarrassing presentation or recall with precision the words spoken during an argument, the visceral pain that once accompanied those memories has softened into something more manageable, almost historical. This bias appears to operate as a protective mechanism, gradually allowing us to process difficult experiences without carrying the full weight of their emotional burden indefinitely. The brain seems engineered to preserve information while systematically reducing the effective sting, creating distance between our present self and past suffering. What makes this phenomenon particularly intriguing is that positive emotions attached to memories seem to fade far more slowly, or sometimes not at all, meaning that over the years our past becomes increasingly populated by pleasant memories, while painful ones become narratives we can discuss with emotional detachment. We normalize this process entirely, rarely pausing to recognize how our minds are constantly rewriting our emotional histories, rendering our past suffering less painful than it was originally experienced, allowing us to move forward not by forgetting, but by gradually ceasing to feel the weight of what we remember. Consider the way human memory reconstructs the past, not as it was, but as we wish it to have been, painting earlier experiences with a warm and golden hue that the present moment never quite possessed when we lived through it. When you remember your childhood summers, you do not recall the boredom, the petty arguments with siblings, or the oppressive heat that made you irritable. Instead, you remember endless freedom, carefree days, and a sense of wonder that seems impossible to recapture now. This phenomenon, known as Rosy Retrospection, fundamentally alters how we experience our own history, creating a persistent gap between what actually occurred and what our minds insist happened. The mechanism underlying this distortion operates through several interconnected psychological processes, beginning with the simple fact that negative emotions are cognitively taxing and therefore more likely to be forgotten or minimized over time, while positive emotions leave stronger, more durable traces in memory. Additionally, our current emotional state acts as a filter through which we evaluate past events. So if you are unhappy today, you unconsciously reinterpret yesterday as better than it truly was, creating a comforting contrast that makes the present seem temporary rather than permanent. We also possess a deep psychological need for narrative coherence, for our lives to make sense as stories with meaning and progress, and this need motivates us to revise memories that would otherwise seem pointless or chaotic. Furthermore, we tend to forget the intensity of physical discomfort, hunger, or frustration, retaining instead only the abstract knowledge that these things occurred, which allows us to abstract away the grinding difficulty of past circumstances. What persists as fascinating is how completely normalized this distortion has become, how we accept without question that our memories are inherently unreliable narrations rather than recordings. And yet we continue to make decisions based on these reconstructed pasts, planning our futures around versions of history that never quite existed. Imagine you spend an entire evening at a restaurant with someone you care about. The first 2 hours are pleasant enough, with good conversation and decent food, but nothing particularly memorable occurs. However, as you approach the end of the meal, the waiter brings out an exceptional dessert that arrives at your table with theatrical presentation, and the final moments of your time together are filled with genuine laughter and warmth. Weeks later, when asked about that evening, you recall it as one of the most wonderful experiences you've shared, glossing over the mundane middle portions entirely. This phenomenon is the Peak-End rule, a cognitive bias where human beings judge their experiences almost exclusively based on two specific moments: the most intense point, whether positive or negative, and the final moment as the experience concludes. The rule suggests that we do not average our moment-by-moment experiences to form an overall judgment, which would be the logical approach. Instead, our memories prioritize these two temporal anchors while discarding vast stretches of intermediate time from consideration. Psychologists have documented this pattern repeatedly across diverse domains, from medical procedures, where a brief moment of reduced pain at the end can reshape how patients recall an otherwise painful experience, to vacations where a disappointing final day can taint months of accumulated joy, to relationships where a person's overall assessment depends disproportionately on recent interactions rather than the accumulated history between two people. The mechanism operates through the interplay of attention and memory consolidation. Intense moments command our cognitive resources and embed themselves more deeply in neural pathways, while the final moment benefits from recency bias and serves as the last imprint on our consciousness, thereby disproportionately influencing how we file away and retrieve the entire experience. Consider the experience of sitting through a dental procedure that lasts 30 minutes, where the discomfort is constant and moderate throughout the entire time, compared to a different dental visit where you experience intense pain for only 5 minutes followed by 25 minutes of complete comfort. When asked which experience was worse, most people report that the first scenario was more unpleasant, even though they suffered significantly less total pain in that situation. This phenomenon reveals a curious blind spot in how human beings evaluate their own experiences, a blind spot that psychologists call duration neglect. The mechanism underlying this paradox emerges from the way our brains encode memories and assign emotional weight to events. Rather than calculating the true cumulative suffering across time, our minds instead rely heavily on the peak intensity of discomfort and the final moments of the experience, creating what researchers term the Peak-End rule. When we retrospectively evaluate an experience, we neglect to properly weight the actual duration of suffering against these more salient emotional markers, leading us to remember 30 minutes of moderate pain as somehow worse than 5 minutes of severe pain, despite the mathematical reality of total suffering. This happens because our brains are not equipped with accurate duration meters, and because intensity and recency create stronger memory traces than the mere passage of time itself. Remarkably, this tendency persists even when we are explicitly told about it, even when we understand it logically, and even when we have years of evidence demonstrating that we consistently make these duration-based errors in our evaluations. We continue to organize our lives around avoiding peak intensity rather than minimizing total suffering, and we continue to make choices that extend our moderate discomfort because we misjudge how our future selves will remember and evaluate that experience. Imagine a person who has spent months dreaming about purchasing their ideal home, visualizing every detail from the marble countertops to the expansive backyard, only to finally move in and discover that within weeks, the initial euphoria has completely dissolved into their baseline level of contentment, and they find themselves just as satisfied or dissatisfied as they were before the purchase. Despite the fact that nothing about their actual living circumstances has fundamentally changed, except for their attention being redirected elsewhere. This is the focusing illusion, a cognitive bias where we dramatically overestimate the emotional impact that any single life event or possession will have on our overall happiness and well-being, simply because we are currently directing all of our mental focus and attention toward that particular thing. The mechanism at work here is remarkably straightforward yet profoundly consequential. When we concentrate intensely on one aspect of our lives, that aspect becomes disproportionately important in our minds, and we unconsciously discount or ignore all the other factors that actually determine our moment-to-moment contentment, such as our relationships, our health, our daily routines, and our sense of purpose. We imagine that acquiring the dream job, the luxury car, or the perfect romantic partner will transform our entire existence because, in our imagination, we are focusing entirely on that single variable while mentally blocking out the neutral or negative aspects that inevitably accompany any life change. What makes this illusion so persistent and so deeply embedded in human psychology is that it operates at a level beneath conscious awareness. And even when we intellectually understand that adaptation and hedonic decline are real phenomena that affect our happiness, we continue to behave as though this particular event will be the exception, that this time the focusing illusion simply will not apply to us. Imagine standing at a crossroads in life where you must make a significant decision, perhaps accepting a new job in a distant city or ending a long-term relationship, and you find yourself paralyzed by the conviction that this choice will fundamentally and permanently alter the trajectory of your entire existence. You visualize yourself 5 years hence, still devastated by this decision, still haunted by the roads not taken, still unable to recover from the emotional weight of this single moment. Yet what research consistently reveals is that humans are remarkably poor at predicting how much any given life event will actually impact their long-term happiness and emotional well-being. This phenomenon is called impact bias, and it describes our systematic tendency to overestimate the duration and intensity of our emotional reactions to future events. When we contemplate losing our job, we imagine months of despair. When we picture a romantic rejection, we see ourselves perpetually wounded. When we consider moving to a new city, we envision endless loneliness and regret. The psychological mechanism underlying this bias emerges from several interconnected sources. First, when we imagine a future event, we tend to focus intensely on that single occurrence, isolating it in our mind and examining it from every angle, which artificially amplifies its apparent significance. Our brains struggle to simultaneously simulate the emotional weight of an event, while also imagining the countless other experiences, relationships, and daily moments that will continue to occur around it in real life. Second, we possess a remarkable psychological capacity called hedonic adaptation, which allows us to adjust our baseline emotional state and return to relatively consistent levels of happiness regardless of major life changes. Yet we fail to account for this adaptation when predicting our future reactions. We assume we will remain devastated indefinitely, not recognizing that humans naturally acclimate to new circumstances and that the intensity of emotion fades as time passes and as we incorporate experiences into our broader life narrative. Imagine yourself sitting comfortably in your warm home during winter, and a friend calls to ask if you can help them move boxes from their unheated garage on a freezing afternoon. In that moment, warm and relaxed, you genuinely believe you will be fine with the cold, that it will not bother you much, and you agree readily to help. But when you arrive at that garage hours later, shivering within minutes, teeth chattering, fingers going numb, you find yourself irritable, resentful, and wondering why you ever agreed to this. The cold feels so much worse than you predicted, so much more unbearable than your warm imagination allowed you to believe. This is the hot-cold empathy gap, a profound failure of our ability to predict how our emotional and physical states will change our behavior, preferences, and tolerance for discomfort. The mechanism underlying this gap is fundamentally about the gap between our current state and our ability to accurately simulate a radically different state. When we are warm, comfortable, and content, our brain has difficulty truly imagining what it feels like to be genuinely cold, even if we have experienced cold before. Our current emotional temperature, so to speak, acts as an anchor that biases all our predictions about how we will feel in other states. We believe ourselves to be more rational and resilient than we actually are, more capable of enduring discomfort than our present comfort-based perspective can accurately assess. What makes this paradox persist is that we rarely learn from it. We experience the gap, suffer through the cold, and later return to warmth, where we once again underestimate how unpleasant cold will be. Each time we make a commitment from a hot state, we fail to access the true emotional reality of the cold state we will eventually inhabit. We have normalized this gap into everyday life, accepting that our future selves will be somewhat irritable or less cooperative than our present selves promised, yet we continue making predictions from our comfortable, current perspective anyway. Consider the individual sitting at their desk on a Monday morning, preparing for a meeting they believe they can influence through careful preparation and strategic thinking. Yet the outcome has already been determined by factors entirely beyond their awareness or reach, such as the predetermined budget cuts their supervisor announced in a private conversation the week before, or the political dynamics between departments that have nothing to do with the quality of their presentation. And yet they spend hours organizing their thoughts, selecting the perfect font for their slides, and rehearsing their delivery as though these actions have direct causal power over the result they desire. This is the illusion of control, a pervasive cognitive bias wherein human beings systematically overestimate the degree to which they can influence events and outcomes, particularly in situations involving chance, probability, or factors governed by other people's independent choices and hidden motivations. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to operate through our brain's fundamental need to construct narratives of agency and predictability in an inherently chaotic and uncertain world. As the human mind is deeply uncomfortable with randomness and powerlessness, so it unconsciously inflates the significance of actions we can take, attributes success to our personal efforts while minimizing the role of luck or external circumstances, and creates a comforting sense that we are pilots of our own destiny rather than passengers swept along by forces we cannot see or control. This bias becomes particularly pronounced in domains where skill and chance intermingle ambiguously, such as gambling, investing, health outcomes, or career advancement, where our past successes reinforce the belief that we possess genuine influence, even when we have simply been fortunate enough to benefit from circumstances aligned in our favor. Consider the moment when someone asks you to explain how a zipper works, or how a toilet flushes, or what makes democracy function at a systemic level, and you realize with sudden discomfort that despite using these things confidently every single day, you cannot actually articulate the mechanisms involved with any meaningful precision or depth. You possess what feels like comprehensive understanding until you are forced to verbalize it, at which point the supposed knowledge fragments into vague gestures and hand-waving explanations that sound increasingly hollow even to your own ears. This phenomenon is the illusion of explanatory depth, a cognitive bias in which we dramatically overestimate the extent of our own understanding about how things, people, systems, and the world itself actually work. The mechanism underlying this paradox stems from the distinction between shallow familiarity and genuine comprehension. We encounter objects and concepts repeatedly throughout our lives, developing fluent interactions with them without ever constructing detailed mental models of their internal workings or underlying principles. This fluency creates a false sense of understanding because the ease with which we navigate the world seems to confirm that we comprehend it, when in reality we are simply moving through practiced patterns and automated responses. Our brains are extraordinarily efficient at reducing cognitive load by filing away complex systems into simple categorical folders, allowing us to function without being paralyzed by the need to understand everything at a granular level. What makes this illusion particularly persistent is that it serves us reasonably well in daily life. We need not understand the physics of flight to board an airplane, nor must we comprehend monetary policy to use currency, and this practical adequacy reinforces the sensation that we do in fact understand these domains. The illusion only becomes apparent when we are prompted to explain, to teach, or to defend our knowledge, situations that relatively rarely occur in our ordinary existence. Imagine sitting at a roulette table where red has come up 7 times in a row, and you find yourself becoming increasingly convinced that black must be due to appear next. So you place a larger bet on black than you normally would because surely the odds are in your favor now after such a long streak of red. This is the gambler's fallacy in its most recognizable form, a cognitive bias that leads us to believe that past results in independent random events influence the probability of future outcomes, even though mathematically they do not. The roulette wheel has no memory, no consciousness, no ability to keep track of what has happened before, and yet our minds create a narrative of balance and correction where none actually exists. We imagine that the universe operates according to a principle of equilibrium, that luck must somehow swing back in our direction after a period of misfortune, that randomness must self-correct towards some kind of mean or fairness. What actually happens in our brains during this moment is that we commit a fundamental error in probability reasoning by conflating the law of large numbers with the independence of individual events. We know intuitively that over many thousands of coin flips, roughly half should be heads and half should be tails, and this knowledge is correct, but we incorrectly apply it to short sequences where deviations from 50-50 splits are entirely normal and expected. The gambler's fallacy persists despite centuries of mathematical proof that each spin, flip, or shuffle is completely independent of all previous ones. Perhaps because our survival as a species has depended on pattern recognition and our ability to predict cycles in nature, where patterns often do matter and causality is real. We have evolved to see patterns everywhere, even where none exist, and in the context of gambling or financial markets or personal belief systems, this ancient cognitive tendency becomes a systematic error that costs us money, time, and emotional peace. Imagine a basketball player who has made 5 shots in a row, and as they approach the court for their 6th attempt, everyone in the arena seems to believe that this player is now more likely to make the next shot simply because of their recent success. The commentators speak with certainty about the player being hot, the teammates actively seek to pass them the ball, and the opposing defense tightens around them with a sense of inevitability. This is the hot hand fallacy in its purest form, a cognitive bias so deeply embedded in how we interpret patterns that it has shaped professional sports strategy, gambling decisions, and countless moments of human judgment across centuries. The mechanism underlying this fallacy is our brain's profound inability to accept true randomness and our desperate need to find patterns even when none exist. When we observe a sequence of successful outcomes, we unconsciously assume that the probability of the next success has somehow increased, when in mathematical reality, each shot remains an independent event with the same probability as every other shot the player has ever taken. Our pattern recognition systems, which evolved to keep us alive by detecting genuine correlations in nature, become overactive in our modern world and begin to see intention and momentum where there is only statistical noise. The hot hand fallacy persists with remarkable tenacity because it feels intuitively true, because narratives of momentum and flow are psychologically satisfying, and because occasionally, by pure chance, hot hands do continue their streaks, which selectively reinforces our belief. We have normalized this fallacy so thoroughly that entire industries, from sports broadcasting to casino design, are built upon exploiting and amplifying our susceptibility to it. Even knowing the mathematics, even understanding the independence of events, we continue to feel the hot hand effect whenever we witness success, because feeling is older and stronger than knowing. Imagine you're scrolling through your phone at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, when you notice that your ex texted you at exactly the same time you were thinking about them, and suddenly, the entire universe feels like it's conspiring to tell you something meaningful about your connection. Or consider the person who sees a cloud shaped like their deceased grandmother's face and feels an overwhelming sense of her presence watching over them. Or the individual who notices that they keep seeing the number 11 repeatedly on clocks, license plates, and receipts, and becomes convinced that this number holds a special significance just for them. These experiences feel profound and intentional in the moment, charged with meaning and purpose, as if the world itself is trying to communicate directly with you through invisible patterns and hidden connections. Apophenia is the human tendency to perceive meaningful connections and patterns in random or meaningless data, to find significance where none objectively exists, and to construct elaborate narratives around coincidences that are statistically inevitable in a world of infinite variables. The psychological mechanism underlying apophenia involves our brain's fundamental drive to find patterns, a survival instinct that evolved because noticing genuine patterns in nature often proved crucial for avoiding danger and locating resources. Our minds are pattern recognition machines optimized for false positives because historically, mistaking a shadow for a predator was far less costly than failing to notice an actual threat. And this same bias causes us to see connections and meanings even when we're simply observing random noise. What makes apophenia so persistent and so difficult to overcome through logic alone is that it feels utterly convincing and emotionally resonant in the moment, bypassing our rational faculties and appealing directly to our deep psychological need to believe in a coherent, meaningful universe where events connect to us personally. Consider the person who lives in a flood zone but has never experienced a major flood in their lifetime, and therefore assumes that the risk statistics they read about simply do not apply to their particular street, their particular year, their particular circumstances. Consider the investor who watched the market crash in 2008 but continues to hold the same portfolio composition, believing that another such crash is simply unlikely to happen again in their lifetime because they survived the last one without total loss. Consider the communities that build in hurricane corridors, that settle on fault lines, that establish themselves in valleys prone to mudslides, operating under the assumption that if disaster has not struck recently, then perhaps it will not strike at all. This is normalcy bias, and it represents one of the most persistent distortions in human risk assessment, the tendency to underestimate the possibility of disaster and to assume that life will continue functioning as it has functioned in the immediate past. The mechanism behind this bias emerges from the way our brains process threat and probability. Our minds are extraordinarily efficient at pattern recognition when patterns are regular and consistent, but they struggle profoundly when asked to imagine events that fall outside the range of our personal experience. The brain essentially treats the familiar as the safe, not because we consciously reason this way, but because evolutionary survival required us to focus our vigilance on immediate, visible threats rather than on statistical abstractions. When nothing catastrophic has happened, the absence of catastrophe becomes evidence of safety rather than merely evidence of luck. We internalize the normal state as the inevitable state, and this internalization is so thorough, so complete, that even when we consciously acknowledge the possibility of rare events, we still make decisions that reflect an underlying belief in their improbability. This bias persists because the alternative would be paralyzing. Consider the person who receives an unsettling medical diagnosis but decides not to open the letter from their doctor, instead placing it unopened in a drawer where it will remain for weeks or months, untouched and unexamined, as though the reality of the news might somehow diminish or disappear through sheer avoidance. Or think of the individual who notices their bank account balance dwindling due to poor financial decisions, yet deliberately avoids checking their statements, refusing to face the actual numbers that would confirm their fears. This is the ostrich effect, a cognitive bias where we actively avoid seeking out information we suspect will be negative or anxiety-inducing, operating under the false assumption that remaining ignorant somehow protects us from the consequences. The psychological mechanism behind this behavior stems from our deeply wired aversion to emotional discomfort and our desire to preserve our current mental state, even when obtaining the information might allow us to take corrective action. When we anticipate bad news, our brains perceive the act of seeking information as equivalent to experiencing the negative outcome itself, and so we engage in what psychologists call information avoidance, postponing the psychological pain at the cost of practical disadvantage. What makes this paradox particularly persistent is that the avoidance itself often feels justified in the moment, creating a soothing illusion of control when in reality we are surrendering agency and allowing problems to compound unchecked. We have normalized this response in our culture through countless justifications. We tell ourselves we are protecting our mental health by avoiding negativity. We convince ourselves the problem will resolve itself without intervention. We rationalize that knowing the truth would only make us suffer more. Yet the irony remains that this very avoidance typically produces worse outcomes than facing the information directly would have, transforming a manageable problem into a crisis that demands our urgent attention. Imagine you're sitting with a friend the day after a major sporting event, and they confidently tell you exactly what they predicted would happen before the game ended, even though you remember them being uncertain throughout the match itself. This is hindsight bias at work, a cognitive phenomenon so pervasive that we rarely notice it operating within ourselves, yet it fundamentally shapes how we interpret our past decisions and the decisions of others around us. Hindsight bias is the tendency for people to perceive past events as more predictable than they actually were, a retrospective distortion where once an outcome is known, we unconsciously reconstruct our prior beliefs and memories to align with that outcome, convincing ourselves that we saw it coming all along. When we look backward at any historical event, whether it's the collapse of a company, the outcome of an election, the failure of a relationship, or a personal mistake we once made, our brain performs an invisible editing job that removes the genuine uncertainty that existed before the event occurred, replacing it with a false sense of inevitability and predictability. The mechanism underlying this bias appears to be rooted in how our memory systems work and how we construct narratives about causality, as our brains naturally seek patterns and connections, particularly once we know the endpoint of a story, and we unconsciously prioritize information that supports the actual outcome while downplaying or forgetting the contradictory signals and possibilities that existed in real time. What makes hindsight bias particularly persistent despite its logical inconsistency is that it serves a psychological function, providing us with a sense of control and understanding by allowing us to believe we could have predicted outcomes if only we had been more careful or astute. Yet this false sense of predictive ability actually prevents us from accurately learning from experience and from developing genuine wisdom about the actual uncertainty that characterizes human events and decision-making. Imagine walking into a prestigious university and observing the accomplished students who graduated and went on to build successful companies, and you naturally begin to study their habits, their routines, their educational choices, and their personality traits, assuming that these visible characteristics are what caused their success. Yet what you are fundamentally failing to see is the vast graveyard of students who possessed identical habits, identical work ethics, and identical strategic decisions, but who encountered different circumstances, different timing, different market conditions, or simple bad luck, and who therefore disappeared from your view entirely because they did not survive to become the celebrated examples you are now analyzing. This is survivorship bias, and it represents one of the most insidious distortions of reality that exists in human cognition, because it causes us to draw conclusions based exclusively on the winners while rendering the losers completely invisible. The psychological mechanism at work here is fundamentally one of availability and visibility, for our minds naturally construct theories based on the data points that are easiest to observe and most readily available to us. And the successful people are by definition highly visible, writing books, giving interviews, and appearing in media, whereas the unsuccessful people fade into obscurity and silence, leaving no trace for us to study or learn from. We have normalized this bias so thoroughly that we have built entire industries around studying success stories, publishing motivational biographies, and creating frameworks based on what successful people claim they did right, all while ignoring the crucial fact that we have no actual control group, no comparison to those who did the exact same things and failed, and no way to determine whether success came from the strategies described or from random factors that never made it into the narrative. Imagine yourself in a restaurant, carefully studying the menu for several minutes, weighing the merits of the salmon against the pasta, considering flavors and textures and nutritional value, ultimately pointing to your selection and confidently telling the waiter your decision. The waiter nods, walks away, and returns minutes later with a plate. You begin eating, savoring each bite, and only after consuming half your meal do you glance down and realize with absolute shock that what sits before you is not at all what you ordered. Yet somehow, without the visual confirmation, you had convinced yourself completely that you were eating exactly what you had chosen. This phenomenon is choice blindness, a remarkable quirk of human perception where we become cognitively blind to discrepancies between the choices we believe we have made and the actual outcomes we receive. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something deeply unsettling about the architecture of human awareness. When we make a decision, our brains commit strongly to that choice, essentially pre-committing to a narrative about what we selected and why we selected it. This narrative becomes so dominant in our conscious experience that when reality deviates from it, our minds simply fail to register the deviation. The sensory information travels to our eyes, but it does not reach conscious awareness because our narrative is so powerful that it essentially overrides the incoming data. We see what we expect to see rather than what is actually there. What persists most troublingly about choice blindness is how seamlessly we operate under this delusion, how completely we trust our own perceptions even as they systematically betray us, and how readily we confabulate explanations for outcomes that differ entirely from our intentions without ever noticing the fundamental contradiction. We walk through our lives making choices, and then defending those choices with such conviction that we cannot perceive when circumstances have made them irrelevant or when outcomes have rendered our decisions moot. Imagine you are watching a video of two teams passing basketballs back and forth, and you have been explicitly instructed to count the number of passes made by one specific team. You focus intently on this task, your eyes tracking the ball with precision, your mind calculating each exchange with careful attention. Then the video ends, and you are asked a simple question. Did you notice the gorilla that walked across the court in the middle of the scene? For most people, the answer is a startling no, despite the fact that a person in a gorilla suit walked directly through the center of the action, paused, beat their chest, and walked away again. This is inattentional blindness, a phenomenon where our perceptual system fails to register stimuli that appear directly in our field of vision simply because our attention is directed elsewhere. The mechanism underlying this paradox is fundamentally about the limitations of conscious awareness. Our brains process vastly more sensory information than we could ever consciously attend to, and so evolution has equipped us with a filtering system that allows us to focus deeply on what matters while relegating everything else to the background. When you concentrate on counting basketball passes, your attentional resources become consumed by that task, and your visual system effectively becomes blind to unexpected stimuli, not because they are invisible to your eyes, but because they never reach your conscious awareness. What makes this paradox so striking is that it reveals the illusory nature of our perception itself. We feel as though we see the entire world before us in vivid detail, yet we are actually experiencing only a narrow spotlight of conscious attention surrounded by darkness. We have normalized this limitation so thoroughly that we rarely question it, continuing to navigate our lives with the confidence that we perceive reality as it truly is, when in fact we are all moving through the world with significant blind spots, missing gorillas and unexpected events constantly, simply because our attention lies elsewhere. Imagine walking through a grocery store on a Tuesday evening after work, and suddenly you find yourself standing in the cereal aisle, unable to choose between 23 different options, each one promising something slightly different, and you feel an overwhelming sense of exhaustion wash over you despite the fact that you are simply looking at breakfast foods. This is decision fatigue, the phenomenon where the quality of your decisions deteriorates as the number of decisions you must make accumulates throughout your day, leaving you mentally depleted and increasingly unable to engage with even simple choices. The mechanism behind this paradox is rooted in the limited cognitive resources available to each person, a mental energy that functions somewhat like a battery that gradually depletes with use. Each decision, whether significant or trivial, requires your brain to evaluate options, weigh consequences, and commit to a course of action. And this process consumes glucose and neural resources that are finite and renewable only through rest and nourishment. By the time you reach that cereal aisle, you have already made hundreds of decisions that day. What to wear, which emails to answer first, how to respond to a colleague's comment, whether to take the stairs or elevator, what to eat for lunch, and countless micro-decisions that accumulate into a cognitive burden you do not consciously register. What makes this particularly paradoxical is that we live in a society that celebrates endless choice and personal autonomy, yet our brains were not evolutionarily designed to handle this constant barrage of options and decisions. And so we continue to construct environments with proliferating choices despite clear evidence that more options lead to worse decisions and greater psychological distress. We have normalized this exhaustion as simply part of modern life, accepting that we will feel increasingly irritable, impulsive, and indecisive as days progress, when in fact we are observing a predictable biological constraint asserting itself against an unnatural cognitive demand. Consider the moment when you stand before a decision that matters, perhaps choosing between two job offers, selecting which apartment to rent, or deciding whether to end a relationship that no longer serves you. You begin to gather information with what feels like reasonable diligence, reading reviews, asking friends for advice, creating spreadsheets, weighing pros and cons with meticulous care. Yet as hours turn into days and days into weeks, you find yourself no closer to a decision, only deeper in a fog of competing information and hypothetical scenarios. This is analysis paralysis, the peculiar human tendency to become so thoroughly overwhelmed by the complexity of a choice that we become unable to choose at all, often sacrificing the opportunity itself in the process. The psychological mechanism operates through a fundamental miscalibration of how much information is actually necessary to make a good decision. Our minds evolved in environments where more information generally did improve outcomes, where knowing more about a potential threat or resource was almost always advantageous. However, in modern life, we have access to functionally infinite information, yet our decision-making capacity has not expanded accordingly. We convince ourselves that if we just gather a little more data, read one more article, consult one more expert, the right answer will become obvious, that the fog will lift and clarity will emerge. But this rarely happens because the problem was never actually a lack of information. It was the simple fact that most meaningful decisions do not have objectively correct answers waiting to be discovered. We have normalized this paralysis to such a degree that it scarcely registers as problematic anymore, treating it as a sign of thoughtfulness or conscientiousness rather than recognizing it for what it often is, a form of decision avoidance dressed up in the language of prudence. Imagine walking into a coffee shop and noticing something peculiar about the couple sitting by the window. They lean toward each other at nearly identical angles, their hands rest on the table in similar positions, and when one person laughs, the other's face mirrors the expression moments later. You might assume they are deeply connected, finishing each other's sentences and moving through the world as a synchronized unit. What you are observing is the chameleon effect, a subtle psychological phenomenon where people unconsciously mimic the postures, gestures, speech patterns, and mannerisms of those around them, particularly individuals they find likable or wish to connect with more deeply. This mimicry happens without conscious awareness, operating beneath the threshold of deliberate intention, and it serves as a powerful social lubricant that facilitates bonding and creates feelings of rapport between individuals who might otherwise remain distant or guarded in their interactions with one another. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action, essentially creating a neural simulation of another person's behavior within our own cognitive architecture. When we subtly copy someone's mannerisms, our brain begins to align with theirs on a neurological level, and this alignment generates genuine feelings of liking and connection that feel authentic and emotionally grounded rather than artificially constructed. The chameleon effect becomes self-reinforcing because the person being mimicked, often unconsciously aware that they are being imitated, experiences increased liking toward the mimicker, creating a positive feedback loop where both parties feel more connected and inclined toward further social engagement and intimacy.